I remember the moment I first saw Hollow Creek. It wasn't on any map I had studied, not in the guidebooks, not on the GPS I kept checking in vain. The road leading there was a narrow ribbon of cracked asphalt, lined with trees that leaned inwards, their bare branches forming shadows across the pavement like gnarled fingers. A fog hung low over the ground, thick, but not quite enough to obscure the road completely. The sun was setting, though its light was muted, almost reluctant, struggling through the gray haze. I had driven for hours, hopping for a break in the monotony of the long, empty highways. Hollow Creek appeared suddenly, almost as if it had sprung from the mist itself. There was a sign at the town's entrance, leaning at a dangerous angle. Its paint was faded, the letters nearly impossible to read. Hollow Creek population. The question mark had been scratched into the wood, probably by someone long gone or maybe by no one at all. I slowed the car, curiosity pressing against a sense of unease that had started to gnaw at me earlier, when the road had narrowed and the trees had begun to crowd me from both sides. Something about the air here was different, heavy, almost viscous, carrying a scent of damp earth and rotting leaves. The town itself looked frozen in time. I drove slowly along Main Street, my headlights casting long, soft beams across abandoned storefronts. The windows were dusty, the paint on the doors peeling, but the buildings themselves stood straight and tall, untouched by collapse or decay beyond the surface. I could see signs of daily life, clothes still hanging on lines in small backyards, a newspaper fluttering across the porch of what looked like a general store, but no one moved, no one at all. At first I thought the residents might be hiding. Perhaps there was some kind of event, a festival, or an emergency that had drawn them indoors. But as I continued down the street, my unease grew. Cars sat parked in driveways, engines cold and silent. A swing moved slightly in a small park, but the motion was slow, unnatural, like a memory being replayed. Leaves whispered as they drifted across the empty roads, stirred by a wind that felt alive, aware of my presence. I stopped the car in front of what looked like an old diner. Its sign, the Creekside Cafe, swung gently on rusty hinges. I stepped out, my boots crunching on gravel mixed with fallen leaves. The air was colder here, carrying a dampness that seeped into my coat. I walked toward the entrance, expecting to find someone, anyone, but the door was locked and no sound came from inside. The chairs were stacked on the tables as if someone had left in a hurry. A cup sat on the counter, tipped over, its contents long dried into a dark stain. It was the little details that made the town feel wrong. A single, tiny handprint on a dusty window, smudged as though someone had pressed it there, then disappeared. A dog collar hanging from a fence post, empty, swinging in the wind. And then in a small yard nearby, a bicycle leaned against a tree, fallen leaves gathered around its wheels as if no one had touched it for years, yet the tire tracks in the mud were fresh. I glanced around quickly, half expecting someone to appear from behind a corner. There was no one, only the sound of my own breathing and the occasional creak of a sign swinging in the wind. I returned to my car, heart still thudding, trying to reason it out. Maybe it was a ghost town, abandoned decades ago, though everything seemed far too well maintained for that. Maybe it was a trick of the light and fog playing on my mind. Still, my instincts screamed at me that something wasn't right. I considered leaving, but I was drawn forward, compelled to see more, to understand what had happened here. As I drove deeper into Hollow Creek, I noticed the town's layout was strange. Streets curved in ways that didn't make sense on a map. Buildings appeared and disappeared from view, their positions inconsistent with any logical plan. It was disorienting, subtle at first, but growing stronger with every turn. I passed a small church with its doors wide open, revealing an interior untouched, yet eerily silent. The pews were lined with dust-covered hymnals, the altar immaculate. No sound, no light. Just a stillness that pressed in on me. In the center of town, a small fountain bubbled weakly, though I hadn't seen any visible source of water. Its basin was filled with murky liquid, reflecting the dimming sky above. I stepped closer, noticing the faint ripple of something moving just beneath the surface. But when I leaned in, there was nothing, only the dark water staring back at me. A bird, or maybe just the wind, shook a branch above me, sending a scattering of leaves onto the cobblestones. The sound was loud in the quiet of the town, startling, and I found myself holding my breath. I continued along the outskirts, spotting what looked like a small school. Windows dark, doors closed, playground abandoned. I imagined children here once, their laughter filling the air, replaced now by the almost tangible absence of life. In the empty parking lot, tire tracks led to the back, stopping abruptly in the mud. I crouched down, examining them, trying to gauge how long ago they had been made. Fresh, very fresh. And yet no car, no signs of a person. By the time I reached the far end of Hollow Creek, the sky had turned a darker gray. The fog thickened, curling around the buildings like slow-moving smoke. Shadows gathered in the corners of my vision, subtle, fleeting, but persistent. I felt as if I were being watched, not by someone present, but by the town itself, the houses, the streets, the forgotten alleys. A silent scrutiny that made my skin prickle. I parked the car at the edge of town, a small patch of dirt beside the old post office, and sat for a long moment. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. Part of me wanted to leave, to drive back into the fading light of the highway, but another part, the part that had always been drawn to the unknown, the quiet darkness, kept me rooted. I watched the fog curl and drift, observed the way shadows seemed to stretch longer, thinner, and I realized that Hollow Creek wasn't just empty. It was waiting. Waiting for something. Waiting for me, maybe. I finally opened the car door, stepping onto the soft earth. My boots sank slightly into the damp ground. The silence pressed against my ears, a quiet, patient silence that demanded attention. As I walked toward the town square, I noticed one last thing before night fully claimed the sky. A single light flickered in a window of the house at the end of the street. Dim, yellow, unsteady, like a candle struggling to stay alive. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, and in that moment I could have sworn I saw a figure move past the glass. Not a child, not an adult, not anyone I recognized. Just a shadow passing by the window. I didn't speak, didn't move. My own breath sounded loud in the quiet, and then, slowly, imperceptibly, the light went out. I walked back into the center of Hollow Creek just as the fog began to thicken, curling around the corners of the buildings and hiding the edges of the streets. The air was heavy, damp, and quiet, but not empty. There was something beneath the silence, soft and subtle, almost imperceptible if I hadn't been listening so carefully. At first, I thought it was my own footsteps on the cracked asphalt, the gentle crunch of leaves under my boots. But then I noticed it, a faint, barely audible sound, like someone whispering far away, just beyond the reach of my vision. I stopped immediately, holding my breath. The whispering didn't continue in words I could understand. It was more like a soft vibration in the air, an echo that seemed to bounce from one building to another. I tilted my head, trying to trace its source, but the sound moved, shifting unpredictably. It was always just ahead, or to the side, or sometimes behind me, never in one place long enough for me to see anyone or anything. I walked slowly, taking small, deliberate steps, my senses stretched to their limits. The town was silent otherwise. No birds, no wind through the trees, no creak of doors or shutters. And yet the whispers persisted. Sometimes it sounded like a conversation just out of reach, voices hushed and hurried. Sometimes it was a single sigh, long and low, fading into the fog before I could make sense of it. I felt my pulse quicken. My rational mind told me it could be the wind, or my imagination, but a part of me, the part that had always been drawn to what shouldn't exist, knew this was something else entirely. I passed by a narrow alleyway between two buildings. The shadows there were deep, almost black, swallowing the dim light from the street lamps. The whispering grew clearer for a moment, like someone leaning just around the corner, speaking to me but stopping when I tried to look. I held my breath, peering down the alley. The damp brick walls stretched up, slick with moisture, and I could see the faint glint of something metallic, a tin can, perhaps, or a fragment of a sign, but no movement. No one. The whispers retreated, fading into the distance, leaving only the echo of my own heartbeat. I forced myself to keep walking. The town square appeared ahead, a small open space surrounded by stores and houses, all locked and dark. A fountain sat in the center, its water now still and black in the fog. I paused at its edge, listening. The whispers returned, this time closer, almost at the edge of hearing. I thought I could make out fragments of words, names, maybe, or short phrases, but they dissolved into the mist before I could grasp them. My skin prickled, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to hold onto some sense of warmth, some sense of control. As I walked around the square, I noticed details I had missed before. A chair, overturned in front of a small shop, though the ground beneath it was dry and free of footprints. A curtain swaying slightly in a window, though no breeze moved the air. And then a faint reflection in the dark glass of another shop window, like someone standing behind me. But when I turned, no one was there. My own reflection stared back, pale and tense, eyes wide and searching. The whispers seemed to respond to me, moving with me through the town. I turned down another street, a narrower lane lined with homes that looked lived in, yet abandoned. Pots on porches, plants in windows, toys in yards. Everything frozen as if the inhabitants had vanished mid-motion. And still, the whispers followed, rising and falling, indistinct, teasing. Sometimes I thought I heard laughter, light and fleeting like children playing in the distance. Other times, a sob, low and trembling as if someone were grieving alone. I reached a small bridge over a shallow creek running through the town. Water trickled quietly, reflecting the dim light above. I leaned over the railing, peering into the black water. For a moment, the whispers stopped, and the silence pressed against me like a physical weight. And then, a single word floated across the fog, almost unintelligible, like it had been carried on the water. Go. I jumped back, heart hammering, looking around wildly. No one, nothing. Only the fog twisting lazily around the bridge. I forced myself to take a slow breath, telling myself it could be a trick of the wind, a shape of the mist playing with my mind. But even as I reassured myself, I felt a flicker of dread, a deep and quiet fear that I could not name. Something in Hollow Creek was alive in a way that did not obey reason. Something watched and whispered and perhaps waited. I continued, taking the streets one step at a time, careful not to run, careful not to draw attention to myself. I noticed small details. The faint outline of footprints in the mud near the edges of the road, though they stopped abruptly. A window cracked open just slightly, though no hinge could have moved it. A door with scratches along the frame like nails had pressed against it from the inside. Every sign suggested life, yet no life was present. At one house I thought I saw someone sitting in the window. A shadow hunched over, still as stone, staring out at me. My throat went dry, I blinked. The shadow moved, or perhaps it vanished entirely. I couldn't tell. The whispers became more distinct, closer now, yet still just beyond clarity. A faint humming joined them, a melody I couldn't recognize, low and slow, winding through the empty streets. It was both inviting and repelling, like a lullaby sung to someone long lost. I wanted to speak, to ask if anyone was here, but my voice felt trapped in my chest. I swallowed hard, hearing my own breathing over the whispers. Every instinct told me to leave, to run back to my car, to escape the town while I still could. And yet I couldn't stop myself from moving forward. I had to see. I had to know what had happened here and why the town felt aware of me. The last street I walked before returning toward the square was lined with small houses, their porches empty, lights out, curtains drawn. I noticed a door ajar on one house, swaying slightly with the wind, or perhaps with no wind at all. I stepped closer, curiosity stronger than fear, and peered inside. The room was simple, modest, a table, a few chairs, a small stove. But the floor was covered with scattered papers, pages from books or notebooks, all open as if someone had been reading and left suddenly. And in the center, a single chair faced the window, tipped slightly back. No one sat there. No one moved. And yet I could feel it. Something had been watching me from that room. Something that had not moved, had not breathed, but had been aware. I shivered, turning away, and the whispers seemed to sigh in response, soft and distant, retreating into the fog. I didn't look back as I retraced my steps toward the square, but the sensation lingered, a quiet pressure in the back of my mind, like the town itself remembered me even after I had gone. When I finally returned to the center of Hollow Creek, the fog had thickened to the point where the street lamps barely pierced it. The whispers were faint now, as if fading into the distance, but I could still hear them if I listened closely, soft murmurs curling through the air. I stood there for a long time, letting the quiet settle around me, trying to make sense of what I had heard. It was impossible. The town refused clarity. It was a place that spoke only in hints, in echoes, in half-formed words. I realized then that Hollow Creek was not empty, not entirely. It held memories, fragments of lives, echoes of footsteps, whispers that followed you, traces of moments that should have been lost to time. And in those whispers I felt a warning, subtle and patient. You do not belong here. But I was already drawn in, already walking the streets as if tethered to the town by an invisible cord. And as the fog thickened, I knew that the whispers would not leave me, not yet. They were patient. They could wait. And so could I, though unease had settled in my chest, heavy and relentless, pressing against the calm I tried to maintain. I took one last look around the square, listening carefully, and then slowly turned toward the road leading out, even though a part of me longed to follow the whispers further to see where they led. They seemed to linger just behind me, faint, persistent, like a breath brushing against my neck. And I knew, as I walked, that Hollow Creek would not let me forget them. There was a house at the far edge of Hollow Creek that I had noticed from the road. It stood slightly apart from the others, as if avoiding the square, leaning into the fog. The structure was modest, 2 stories, faded white siding, darkened windows, but it felt different. I had driven past it earlier, but something about the way the fog clung to its corners, the way shadows pooled beneath the eaves, drew me back. I parked my car across the street and stepped out. The cold pressed immediately against my skin, sharper than I remembered in the center of town. The front door was closed, locked perhaps, though I couldn't be certain. A brass knob, tarnished and worn, reflected the dim light of the fog. I approached slowly, running my hand over the wood. It was dry, rough in some places, as if the house had been left untouched for decades. I paused, listening. Nothing moved, but the faintest whisper of sound drifted from inside, a creak, a sigh almost imperceptible. I pressed my ear to the door, holding my breath. It could have been the wind, it could have been anything. But it felt like the house itself was breathing, waiting. I circled the building, looking for another way in. A side window was cracked, its frame warped, but the glass was mostly intact. Peering inside, I saw a room that had once been a living room, now frozen in a moment from the past. Dust lay thick on every surface, but the furniture was arranged as though someone might return at any second. A couch with patterned fabric sagged under time. A small coffee table held a vase, its flowers long dried to brittle stems. A rug lay on the floor, its colors faded, but I could see the outline of something darker beneath it. Footprints, perhaps, though no human had walked here for years. The whispers had followed me from the streets, faint now but present, curling through the fog and into the house. I leaned closer to the window, my fingers brushing the cracked wood, trying to make sense of the shapes inside. And then I noticed the details that made my stomach twist. A coat hung on the back of a chair, sleeves stiff and oddly positioned, like someone had left it mid-motion. Shoes were neatly placed by the doorway, their laces undone, as if whoever had worn them had vanished before finishing the task. I found a back door, slightly ajar, warped by time and weather. I pushed it slowly, listening for any reaction, and it opened with a long groan that echoed through the fog. I stepped inside, boots pressing into the dusty floor. The air smelled of mildew and old wood, but underneath that was something else. A faint sweetness like decaying fruit or perfume left too long in a bottle. The silence inside was complete, heavy, almost suffocating. The living room extended into a narrow hallway. I walked carefully, each step sending small clouds of dust into the air. Every corner of the house seemed to hold its own memory, frozen and waiting. On a small table, I noticed a pair of reading glasses, their lenses clouded with age. A notebook lay open nearby, its pages yellowed and brittle. I lifted it gently. The handwriting was small, cramped, almost meticulous, and the words spoke of ordinary life. Lists of chores, meals prepared, letters written. but occasionally they veered into something strange. Mentions of shadows at windows, of whispers in the halls, of things that moved when no one watched. My breath caught, and I placed the notebook back, careful not to disturb it further. I moved deeper into the house, into what had once been the dining room. A table still bore the faint stains of meals long past, and a chair was tipped slightly as though someone had just stood. Plates sat stacked on the counter, cups on a tray, and in the corner a small child's toy, a wooden horse, lay on its side. I bent down, brushing my hand over it. The paint was chipped, but the shape was intact, and I could almost imagine a small child running across the floor, laughing. But there was no one here. Only the quiet, and the faint whisper of something I could not name. I ascended the narrow staircase cautiously, each step creaking under my weight. The second floor was darker, the windows smaller, letting in only filtered light from the fog outside. The hallway was lined with closed doors. One in particular caught my attention. Its paint was flacking, revealing layers of colors underneath, and the knob was scratched as if someone had tried to open it from the inside. I hesitated, feeling a pulse of anxiety. Part of me wanted to turn away, to leave the house and Hollow Creek behind. But the other part, the part that had been drawn here through the fog, through the whispers, urged me forward. I opened the door slowly. The room was a bedroom, small, with a single bed against the wall. The sheets were neatly tucked, though yellowed with age. A small dresser stood against another wall, its drawers slightly open, revealing folded clothes that looked as though they had been left mid-use. On the dresser, a photograph in a cracked frame caught my eye. It was a family portrait, black and white, a mother, a father, and a small child. Their eyes seemed to follow me, not in a malevolent way, but with a quiet, weighty awareness that made me swallow hard. The whispers grew here, softer, closer, as though the walls themselves were breathing secrets. I could almost make out murmured fragments, names, dates, half-formed phrases, but they dissolved before I could comprehend them. I sat on the edge of the bed, running a hand along the quilt, feeling the stiffness of time and neglect. The air was thick with memories, with lives paused, suspended in the quiet. I imagined the family here, moving through these rooms, their laughter, their arguments, their grief. And then I imagined them gone, vanished without trace, leaving only their echoes behind. In the corner of the room, a small trunk sat beneath the window. I approached it cautiously, the whispers growing more insistent, almost impatient. I lifted the lid. Inside were letters stacked neatly, envelopes brittle. I opened one and the words made me pause. Simple letters at first, notes between family members. But as I read further, the tone shifted. Mentions of fear, of things outside the house watching, of shadows that crept in at night. The last letter was unsigned, written hurriedly, as if the writer had not meant for anyone else to see it. It ended abruptly, mid-sentence, leaving the thought unfinished. I closed the trunk and stepped back, my chest tight. Every detail of this house screamed absence, yet presence at the same time. The belongings frozen mid-motion, the notes, the photographs. They were all reminders of lives that had been lived and then erased. And yet the house did not feel empty. It felt aware of me, aware that I was here, and it waited. I could feel it in the air, a pressure that wasn't physical but undeniable. I lingered for a while longer, walking slowly from room to room. The kitchen was small, the pantry untouched, jars of food preserved by time or decay. The bathroom was neat, towels folded, soap in its dish, toothbrushes in a cup. Nothing had moved, nothing had changed. And yet I knew that someone or something had been here, watching, observing, leaving traces just subtle enough to be noticed by a careful eye. Eventually, I returned to the staircase, descending slowly, reluctant to leave but unable to ignore the unease pressing at my chest. Back in the living room, I paused near the window, looking out at the fog-shrouded street. Hollow Creek lay silent and patient outside, its secrets pressing in from all sides. The whispers were faint now, teasing, receding into the walls, into the air, leaving a residue of dread that lingered in my bones. I stepped outside, closing the door gently behind me. The cold air bit at my face, the fog swirling around me. For a long moment I stood in silence, listening to the town, to the faint echoes that drifted from the streets and buildings. Hollow Creek had allowed me inside the locked house, shown me its memories, but it had left me with questions I could not answer, with a sense of presence that would follow me wherever I went next. And as I walked back toward my car, I realized something unsettling. The town, the house, the whispers, they weren't gone just because I had stepped outside. They were part of me now, etched into my memory, a quiet weight pressing against my mind. And I knew, without knowing how, that Hollow Creek would never fully release me. I couldn't stop thinking about the locked house, even after I had driven back to the edge of Hollow Creek. Its memory pressed against me, soft but unyielding, like the fog itself had followed me from the streets into my car. I knew I had to go back. There was something there I hadn't seen, something that whispered to me through the walls, behind the faded paint under the floorboards. I didn't understand why I felt drawn to it, but I knew the answer wasn't reason. It never was in Hollow Creek. I parked in the same spot across from the house, letting the engine idle for a moment. The fog had thickened further, curling around the rooftops and pooling at the edges of the road. I watched the faint outline of the house, leaning slightly into the mist, and felt that same pulse of awareness I had felt before. Something waited for me inside, something that had always been waiting. I pushed open the back door again, the old wood creaking under my hand, and stepped inside. Dust rose from the floorboards like fine smoke, curling around my boots as I moved through the familiar rooms. Everything was as I had left it, the living room frozen in time, the hallway stretching dimly into the shadows, the staircase narrow and steep. Yet this time I felt a subtle difference. The air itself felt heavier, thicker, carrying a faint metallic tang I hadn't noticed before, like rust or old blood. I went directly to the bedroom on the second floor, the small room where the single bed had been neatly made, the dresser with folded clothes, the photograph that had haunted me. My attention was drawn to the dresser again, and this time I noticed a small panel at the bottom of the furniture I hadn't seen before. It was a sliding compartment, almost invisible, worn smooth with age and use. My heart quickened as I pushed it open, revealing a hidden space inside. There, nestled among the folds of an old, moth-eaten cloth, was a diary. Its cover was dark leather, cracked and soft with age, and the edges of its pages were yellowed and delicate. I picked it up carefully, feeling the weight of it in my hands, the subtle resistance of time pressing against my fingers. I opened the first page. The handwriting was small, deliberate, and precise, but already the words made me uneasy. The diary began like any journal might, names, dates, descriptions of daily life, but very quickly the tone shifted. The writer noted strange occurrences in the town, things that seemed trivial at first but became steadily more unsettling. Doors left open that should have been closed, shadows moving in empty rooms, footsteps echoing along the streets late at night. The author wrote of neighbors vanishing, first a single person, then several at once, leaving behind belongings, half-finished meals, traces of ordinary life frozen mid-motion. I traced the lines with my fingers, feeling the tension rise in my chest. The dates spanned decades, but the entries were uncannily consistent. Every few months, someone would disappear, and always the diary recorded the same strange signs: whispers in the streets, faint glimpses of figures at windows, the sudden feeling that someone or something was watching. The entries grew more frantic as time went on, the handwriting slanting, some words crossed out and rewritten. Fear bled from the pages, heavy and slow, palpable even to someone reading decades later. One passage caught my eye. It described a family, the same one whose photograph I had seen, living in the very house I was in. The diary recounted their daily routines, their lives like any other, until strange events began. Items moved on their own, a recurring shadow in the corner of rooms, whispers that only the children could hear at night. The author's words trembled on the page, detailing how the family vanished one evening without warning. No note, no explanation, no trace beyond their personal belongings left in perfect order. The diary suggested that the town itself had claimed them, swallowed their presence without evidence. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Reading the diary, I could almost hear the whispers in the house again, soft, elusive, curling around my consciousness like smoke. I turned another page and the entries grew more disturbing. Names of other vanished residents spanning decades, all cataloged with dates, descriptions, and the strange, consistent signs. Whispering sounds, shadows at windows, items left mid-motion, footprints appearing and disappearing inexplicably. The diary painted a picture of Hollow Creek as a town that refused to let its residents leave, that held memories, lives, and fears like a living entity. The writing became more urgent as I read. "They watch," one line said, short and emphatic. Another entry, "Do not leave your belongings out, they will remember." And then, "Do not go outside after dusk. The fog carries them and the streets are not empty." I paused, feeling the words press into me, echoing the experiences I had already endured in the town. The diary was not simply a record, it was a warning, though vague, incomplete, impossible to ignore. I turned to the last few pages, the handwriting increasingly erratic. The author described attempts to escape Hollow Creek, efforts to leave the town, the fear that the streets themselves would twist to prevent it. In one particularly chilling passage, the writer claimed to have seen figures, impossible shapes, half shadow, half human, moving silently along the streets, observing, waiting. They never spoke, but the diary suggested they communicated in whispers carried on the fog, in echoes of sound that only sensitive ears could detect. I felt my pulse quicken as I read the final entry. The author had left the diary in this house intentionally, it seemed, as if someone in the future might discover it. The last words were almost a plea. "Do not stay. They are patient. They will wait for you. If you linger, you will become part of the town, part of the memories, and no one will remember you as you are now. Hollow Creek does not forget. It does not forgive." The page ended abruptly, the sentence unfinished, the ink smudged as if by a trembling hand. I closed the diary slowly, placing it back into the hidden compartment. My hands shook, though I tried to steady them. The house seemed quieter now, but in that quiet I could sense the lingering presence, subtle but undeniable. The memories of those who had disappeared, the echoes of their lives, the whispers recorded in the diary, all of it pressed against the walls, against the floors, against me. It was as if the town itself had inscribed its history into the very air I breathed. I stood in the bedroom for a long moment, letting my gaze drift over the details I had noticed before. The neatly made bed, the dresser, the photograph, the small trunk with letters. Everything frozen in time, everything a reminder of lives lived and erased. The diary had made it clear. Hollow Creek was not just a town. It was a place that remembered, that held on, that watched, and it would not release its hold easily. Descending the staircase, I felt the fog pressing at the windows, the soft light from outside muted and gray. The whispers I had followed from the streets were faint but present again, curling through the air like smoke. They were not angry, not loud, not demanding. They were patient. They were waiting, and I could not escape the sense that they were aware of me, aware that I had learned something the town had tried to hide for decades. I stepped back into the living room, the diary still vivid in my mind. The soft creak of floorboards beneath my boots sounded louder than it should have. I glanced around the room, at the frozen objects at the corners where shadows pooled, at the small windows that looked out into the fog. Every detail seemed imbued with memory, with the echo of lives that had vanished, leaving nothing but traces. And now I realized I was part of that continuum, another observer caught in the pull of Hollow Creek. When I finally left the house, closing the back door gently, the fog had thickened further. My car waited silently, headlights off, engine cold. I got in, hands gripping the wheel, heart heavy with unease and curiosity, and for a moment I considered leaving immediately, driving until Hollow Creek faded from view. But even as I thought it, I knew it would not matter. The diary, the house, the whispers, they had already followed me. They had already become a part of my memory, inscribed into the folds of my mind. As I sat in the car, listening to the faint rustle of leaves outside, I realized that Hollow Creek was not just a place of vanished people. It was a place that lingered, that waited, that recorded and remembered. And I understood with a slow, creeping dread that the diary had not merely been a record of past events. It had been a guide, a warning, a map of the town's intent. Whatever force lingered in Hollow Creek was patient, meticulous, and inevitable. It did not need to chase. It only needed to wait. I drove slowly out of the fog that clung to the edges of the town, but I could feel the weight of the diary's contents pressing against my thoughts. Names, dates, disappearances, warnings, they were all there, etched into memory, impossible to ignore. And I knew without doubt that Hollow Creek had not finished with me. It would not let me leave entirely. The town, the whispers, the frozen lives, I carried them now. And they would continue to whisper, long after the roads had swallowed my car, long after the fog had lifted, lingering in the quiet, patient, and relentless. Night fell over Hollow Creek like a heavy curtain, softening the edges of buildings and streets, swallowing colors into shades of gray and black. The fog, which had been a quiet companion throughout the day, thickened as the sun slipped below the horizon. It rolled along the sidewalks and through the alleys, curling around the corners of houses, seeping under doors and pooling in the low spaces between buildings. I walked slowly, deliberately, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing in. Every step seemed to echo in the still air, though I was certain I was alone. The streets were empty but not silent. There was a sound, almost imperceptible, like fabric brushing against itself, or footsteps so light they barely touched the pavement. I paused, holding my breath, straining to hear, but it vanished as soon as I focused. The town seemed alive in a way that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Hollow Creek wasn't just a place of abandoned buildings and vanished people. It was attentive. It noticed movement, it tracked presence, and it waited. I turned a corner and noticed shadows shifting where there should have been none. The streetlights flickered weakly through the fog, casting elongated shapes that bent and swayed. At first, I thought they were the result of trees moving in the wind, but there were no trees nearby. The shadows moved against the grain of reality, slipping along walls, vanishing and reappearing with no apparent source. My chest tightened. The diary, the locked house, the hidden traces of vanished lives, they all converged in this moment. I was not merely observing Hollow Creek. I was part of it now. I kept walking, careful not to make a sound, though I knew it would not matter. The fog seemed to absorb my presence, yet it also reflected it back in strange, subtle ways. I thought I saw figures at the windows of abandoned houses, hunched shapes that vanished when I looked directly at them. I could hear soft whispers, fragments of words carried on the fog, impossible to catch fully but unmistakable. A name, a date, a warning. I couldn't tell if my mind was inventing these details, or if the town itself was speaking to me. Perhaps it was both. In the square, the old fountain, long dry and cracked, seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. Shadows moved along its edges, almost as if something had been crouching there and now shifted in response to my presence. I wanted to turn away, to retreat into the car, to leave Hollow Creek behind, but curiosity anchored me. I had come this far. I had seen too much. And yet, a deep part of me feared that each step I took carried me further into something that would not let me leave unchanged. I stopped near the fountain and tried to focus on the details. A broken bench leaned precariously against the edge. Rusted cans littered the ground and the fog curled around them like smoke. And then I noticed it, a shadow, separate from the others, flickering at the corner of my vision. I turned my head slowly. Nothing. But when I faced forward again, it was there, closer now, moving in a way that defied explanation. It wasn't cast by any light I could see. It had shape but no substance. It moved deliberately, almost as if it had intent, almost as if it were watching me as closely as I was watching it. I felt my pulse quicken. The diary's words pressed against my memory. They are patient. They will wait for you. I understood now that these shadows were not random. Hollow Creek had learned to mark presence, to recognize those who wandered its streets at night. The town was not inert. It remembered the vanished. It remembered those who came, and it tracked them quietly, deliberately, until they became part of its memory too. A sudden movement at the edge of the square drew my attention. A shadow detached itself from a building and glided across the foggy street. It was thin, tall, and impossibly fluid. For a moment I thought it might be a person, but no one emerged from the mist, no figure followed, and yet the movement was undeniably real. My hands tightened into fists. The air felt heavier, almost viscous, pressing against my skin. I realized that the town itself might be shaping these shadows, bending the fog and light to mark my presence, to test me, to warn me. I began walking again, faster now, though my feet seemed reluctant. The streets were no longer familiar. Every corner seemed distorted, every building slightly off-kilter. Shadows lingered at every edge, stretching longer than they should, moving against the logic of light and gravity. I thought I saw faces, faint, fleeting outlines that vanished when I blinked. Whispers floated around me, disjointed phrases, names of people I had read about in the diary, dates, times, cryptic warnings. Do not stay. They remember. You are next. I could not tell if my mind was creating these sounds or if the town was indeed speaking. A narrow alley drew me in, the fog curling around me like fingers. I hesitated at the entrance, peering into the darkness. The shadows there were denser, thicker, shifting in ways that made no sense. I stepped forward cautiously, boots crunching on gravel. The alley felt alive, the walls pressing inward subtly, almost imperceptibly, reshaping themselves as I moved. I remembered the hidden diary, the house, the vanished families, and I felt a chill that went straight to my bones. Hollow Creek was testing me, studying me. It was aware. Halfway down the alley, I noticed markings on the walls. Scratches, shallow and precise, etched into the brick like tally marks. They were numerous, almost endless. I pressed my hand against the rough surface, and the air around me seemed to thrum, vibrating with subtle energy. I realized that each mark represented someone who had wandered these streets, someone who had disappeared. The shadows seemed to gather near the marking, stretching and swaying in unnatural ways, observing, remembering. I swallowed hard. I had crossed an invisible threshold. I continued along the alley, trying to steady my breathing. The whispers grew louder, though still indistinct, like a language half forgotten. Shapes shifted at the corners of my vision, sometimes appearing to mimic human movement, sometimes stretching into forms I could not comprehend. The fog was no longer neutral. It carried intent. It guided me, but also threatened. I felt eyes on me, hundreds of unseen observers pressing through the mist, watching my every movement. At the far end of the alley, I emerged onto a side street I hadn't noticed before. The buildings here were older, more worn, some boarded up, others sagging. Shadows moved across the facades, brushing windows, stretching along doors. I could hear whispers in a soft, continuous murmur, and my chest tightened as I realized the voices were reciting names. Names from the diary, names of the vanished, names I didn't recognize. I wanted to flee, but the pull was magnetic. I felt as though the town had extended invisible hands into the fog, guiding me along a path I could not resist. I stopped near a corner, leaning against a cold brick wall, trying to collect my thoughts. The fog swirled more densely here, wrapping around the street lamps, diffusing the light into a pale glow. The shadows danced more actively now, separating, merging, moving with a deliberate purpose. I realized that Hollow Creek was alive in a way I could barely comprehend. It remembered its vanished residents. It recorded the presence of newcomers, and it manipulated the environment to make its presence known, all without ever appearing fully. A final shadow flickered past me, closer this time, its form more distinct. It was tall, thin, almost human, but wrong. Its edges blurred as though it were both there and not there, a manifestation of memory, of absence, of the town's will. The whispers rose in pitch just slightly, and I felt the weight of the diary's warnings pressing in. Hollow Creek would not let me leave unchanged. I was being marked, observed, integrated into its continuum. The shadows would follow, even if I left, even if I never returned. I turned slowly, walking back toward the main square, trying to remember which streets I had come from. Each step felt measured, deliberate, like the town itself was dictating my pace. The fog thickened further, curling around my legs, moving with subtle intent. I could feel it now, pressing against my skin, brushing my hair, seeping into my senses. Hollow Creek was not silent. It was aware. And I understood with a creeping, unshakable dread that the shadows I had seen were not just memories. They were guardians, witnesses, and perhaps something more. By the time I returned to the square, the fog had swallowed almost everything. The fountain stood in pale light, the broken bench still leaning against its edge, the streets empty, yet alive. The shadows had vanished, but their presence lingered like a memory etched into the air itself. I breathed slowly, trying to calm the rising fear in my chest. The town had shown me its vigilance, its patience, and its power. I was a part of it now, whether I wanted to be or not. Hollow Creek had claimed my attention, if not yet my being. And as I walked back toward the edges of the town, I understood something terrifying. The vanishing shadows were patient. They did not chase. They waited, they recorded, and they remembered. I remember the first time I saw the asylum. It was looming there at the edge of the forest, dark and silent, a silhouette against the bruised evening sky. The iron gates, tall and rusted, stretched upward like skeletal fingers, guarding the crumbling walls beyond. The place had been abandoned for decades, though everyone in town knew the stories. They whispered about the patients who vanished, the experiments that went too far, the screams that still seemed to echo if you listened carefully. I had never believed in ghosts, exactly, but there was a weight to that building that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I parked my car along the gravel road leading to the gates, the crunch of tires on loose stones breaking the otherwise absolute silence. The air smelled damp, earthy, like rain had fallen recently, though the sky was clear. I stepped out, taking a deep breath. The gates were massive, with peeling black paint and jagged iron spikes that caught the last light of day. I reached for the latch. It resisted at first, stiff with rust, then gave way with a soft screech that seemed to echo into the distance. I stepped through, and the world of the outside, familiar streets, the quiet forest, slipped behind me. The courtyard was enormous, paved with stones cracked and worn by decades of neglect. Weeds had begun to reclaim the space, sprouting through every crevice, curling toward the sky as though reaching for some forgotten sunlight. Broken benches and twisted fragments of iron fencing lay scattered, like remnants of a garden long forgotten. I walked slowly, boots crunching over gravel and dry leaves, trying to ignore the feeling that the building was watching, measuring my presence. The main structure rose above me, a brutalist fortress softened by decay. Windows were shattered or boarded up. Ivy had crept across the walls, thick and black, swallowing the brick and mortar like a slow, patient tide. The front doors, enormous and once grand, now hung slightly ajar, inviting and warning at the same time. I stepped closer, my hand brushing the cool, pitted surface of the wood, and for a moment I imagined the doors creaking open on their own, revealing hallways filled with shadows. Inside, the air was different. It carried the weight of years, the smell of mold and decay, faintly metallic, almost like the air of a hospital I had once visited as a child. My footsteps echoed softly against the stone floors, a hesitant rhythm in the cavernous entryway. Sunlight filtered through broken panes, casting long, fractured beams that fell across the floor in thin lines. Dust danced in the air, illuminated by the faint light, tiny motes floating like ghosts in the emptiness. I moved slowly, each step deliberate. The main hallway stretched before me, lined with doors on either side, each leading to rooms I could only imagine. Some doors were intact, some hanging from their hinges, others completely missing, leaving jagged openings into darkness. I paused at the first open doorway. The room beyond was small, the floor covered in debris, peeling wallpaper clinging to the walls. An overturned chair lay in the center, and a rusted bed frame rested against the far wall. The air felt colder here, and I could almost hear a soft whisper, though I knew it was only my imagination. I continued down the hallway, the sound of my breathing the loudest thing in the building. Every corner seemed to stretch slightly as I approached, hallways bending subtly, rooms deepening into shadows. I felt the pull of memory in the place, as if it held the echoes of the people who had been there. I tried to see past the decay, past the rubble and dust, to imagine the lives that had once filled this asylum. Patients, doctors, nurses, all moving in a world I could no longer touch. The silence was not empty. It was thick, almost tangible, pressing against me with the weight of absence. As I reached the stairwell, the building seemed to shift. The walls creaked softly, and I could swear I heard faint footsteps above me. I paused, straining to listen, but all I heard was the groan of the stairs beneath my own weight. I told myself it was nothing. Buildings make noises, but the unease lingered. Something about this place felt different at night, though the sun had not yet fully set. The shadows were deeper, and the faint whispers of air through broken windows sounded like voices, delicate, soft, just beyond comprehension. I began ascending the stairs slowly, hand tracing the railing, feeling the rough wood beneath my fingertips. Each step groaned in protest, as though protesting intrusion. The stairwell opened onto a long corridor, lined with more rooms, each one darker than the last. I could see remnants of old life. Rusted wheelchairs tipped over, chairs stacked in corners, medical equipment frozen in time. Papers littered the floor, yellowed and curling, some with handwritten notes in a spidery hand, now illegible, but hinting at stories I could not yet decipher. One door at the end of the corridor drew me in more than the others. It was smaller, less imposing, with faint traces of paint still clinging to the surface. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was small, a single cot in the center, a rusted metal table at the side. There was a journal on the table, its leather cover cracked and worn. I picked it up carefully, brushing dust from its surface. The pages were yellowed, ink faded, but the writing was still legible, small, neat script documenting the thoughts of someone long gone. I ran my fingers over the words, feeling the weight of time pressing through the ink. As I read, I felt the building itself respond. A subtle vibration under my feet, the shifting of air, the soft, almost imperceptible hum of the structure settling. It was alive in a way I could not explain, not sentient exactly, but aware. I could sense it noticing me, cataloging me as I cataloged it. The air grew colder, the shadows longer, and I felt an almost magnetic pull toward the other end of the corridor, toward rooms I had not yet seen. The asylum was guiding me, patient, careful, drawing me deeper into its memory. I set the journal down and continued my exploration. Every door I opened revealed more remnants, peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, chairs and beds abandoned mid-use, personal belongings left behind, as if the residents had vanished suddenly. The absence of people pressed in on me more heavily with each room, a weight that made it hard to breathe. And yet I could feel traces of them, as if the building remembered more than I could perceive. The walls held echoes of laughter, of cries, of footsteps that had long since stopped. By the time I reached the east wing, dusk had settled fully, and the shadows pressed against me in earnest. The corridor seemed longer than it should, doors stretching beyond the range of my vision. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath rising in soft clouds. I paused, hand on the wall, listening to the faintest sounds. A creak of a floorboard, a distant clatter, the whisper of air through broken glass. Hollow as it was, the building seemed aware. The gates of solitude were not merely iron and stone. They were a threshold. Beyond them lay memory, absence, and a darkness that watched patiently, waiting for intruders like me. I took a deep breath and stepped further into the east wing, each footstep deliberate. The asylum was quiet but alive, and I knew with a slow, creeping certainty that my presence would not go unnoticed. This was only the beginning, and the gates of solitude had already claimed a part of me, marking me as someone who had seen, someone who had entered, and someone who might never truly leave. The east wing stretched before me like a narrow tunnel of shadow. The air had grown cooler, damp in places, carrying the faint, metallic scent of old blood and rusted metal. My footsteps echoed softly against the worn tiles, each sound sharp in the heavy silence. Sometimes, just out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw movement, nothing more than a flicker of shadow, but it was enough to make my stomach tighten and my pulse quicken. I passed room after room, each frozen in time. Wheelchairs tipped over, beds with thin, cracked mattresses, personal items scattered as if their owners had left in haste. Papers fluttered across the floor, some caught in the corners, others still lying open with faint handwriting curling at the edges. The notes were fragmented, small observations, lists of names, strange diagrams, snippets of a mind trapped somewhere between clarity and chaos. I picked up a page briefly, the paper brittle, words smeared, and felt a shiver crawl down my spine. The person who wrote this had left pieces of themselves behind, and in the silence, those pieces were speaking to me. As I walked, the faintest sound caught my attention. A soft scuff of footsteps, irregular and uneven, coming from somewhere further down the corridor. I froze. My own breathing seemed deafening now, echoing against the walls. The footsteps stopped. I waited, hand pressed lightly against the cold plaster of the wall, straining my ears. There was only silence. And then a whisper. Not a word, not a phrase, just a breath, carried along the hall like a living thing. I swallowed hard and took another step. The corridor bent sharply ahead, and I could see the end only as a dark blur. Shadows pooled along the corners, thickening as if they were alive. The air seemed heavier here, pressing in from all sides. I noticed the faint sound of papers shifting, though no breeze moved. I turned slowly, scanning the room behind me. Nothing. Yet the sensation of being watched grew stronger, a persistent awareness at the back of my mind that I could not ignore. Hollow Creek was gone from me. Now it was the asylum, and it remembered everything. I approached one of the rooms, its door hanging on a single hinge. Inside, the floor was covered in more papers, forming a chaotic tapestry of words and symbols. Rusted medical instruments lay discarded in the corner. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, though decades must have passed since it was last used. I stepped carefully over the debris, picking up a folded note. The handwriting was shaky, almost childlike in its inconsistency, but the words were clear. They watch. They always watch. Don't make a sound. My fingers trembled slightly, brushing over the ink, and I felt a chill press into my shoulders. I moved on, careful not to disturb anything else. The sounds grew more persistent, soft scuffing, faint whispers, papers stirring as though moved by invisible hands. I told myself it was the building settling, the wind through broken windows. But even as I reasoned that way, a part of me knew better. This place was alive with memory, with remnants of human presence that refused to be silent. Every echo of the past pressed against the present, and I could feel it pressing against me. At the far end of the hallway, I paused outside a small room marked with faded letters on a plaque, "Observation Room." The glass windows, dusty and cracked, offered only a blurred view inside. I pressed my palm to the cool surface and peered in. The room was empty, yet I felt it immediately, an absence that was full of attention. The chairs were arranged in a semicircle, and an old recording device sat on a metal table, its cord coiled neatly. Dust swirled faintly around it, catching the last light. I could almost hear faint static, a low hum beneath the silence, like a heartbeat just out of reach. A sudden noise made me flinch, a thump, soft but distinct from somewhere deep within the wing. My heart leapt. I took a slow step forward, then another. The thump came again, rhythmic, deliberate, almost as if it were a signal. I stopped, holding my breath. The shadows shifted at the edge of my vision. Something or someone was moving in the darkness. Not fully visible, but not entirely absent either. I pressed on, each footstep measured, careful. The walls seemed to breathe around me, expanding and contracting in subtle, imperceptible ways. The farther I walked, the more pronounced the whispers became. Names, perhaps, or fragments of sentences brushing against my ears. "Help, please, don't go." I could not be certain if my mind was inventing the words, filling the silence with imagined voices, or if the building itself was speaking. Either way, I felt a weight pressing in, a cold, patient attention that made it impossible to relax. I entered another room, this one larger, with peeling paint and broken furniture. The floor was littered with papers, scraps of clothing, and a tipped-over wheelchair. I paused, trying to take it all in, and then I saw it, a faint shape at the corner of the room, moving slowly. I blinked and it vanished. My breath caught. I wanted to tell myself it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast strangely by the broken windows, but the sensation of being watched had not left. The shape had presence, and presence in Hollow Creek and in this asylum meant memory. I explored further, my curiosity warring with the gnawing unease that had settled in my chest. Each room revealed more fragments, notes, diagrams, personal items, clothing left behind as if the residents had vanished midday. I could almost feel the energy of those who had been here, their anxieties, their fears, their confusions lingering like a faint perfume. The whispers followed me, brushing past my ears, always just out of reach. Every step felt like crossing a threshold, moving deeper into the heart of a place that had absorbed human suffering and refused to release it. I reached a staircase leading downward, the steps worn and uneven. A faint draft carried the scent of damp earth and rusted metal. I hesitated, knowing that basements in places like this often held the darkest secrets. And yet, something pulled me forward. I descended slowly, my hand trailing along the chipped railing. The whispers grew softer here, almost reverent, as if the very walls acknowledged my intrusion but did not yet judge it. At the bottom, the corridor stretched into deeper darkness. The air was thick and cold, clinging to my skin. I could see faint outlines of doors along the hallway, some ajar, others sealed with heavy locks long since rusted through. A low, rhythmic sound echoed from one of the rooms, a tapping, irregular but deliberate. I approached carefully, pressing my ear to the door. There was nothing inside, and yet when I stepped back, the tapping seemed to follow me, moving down the hall in rhythm with my own heartbeat. I understood then that the asylum was alive in memory if not in flesh. Every sound, every shadow, every flicker of movement was a trace of the past, echoing endlessly. The whispers, the footsteps, the rustling of papers, they were not random. They were reminders, warnings, invitations to remember, to feel, to see. I felt the weight of decades pressing down on me, and I realized that my presence would not go unnoticed. The building had already registered me. I was a visitor, yes, but also a participant in the endless recollection of suffering, confusion, and fear that lingered here. I stepped forward slowly, deeper into the corridor, feeling the pull of the past guiding me. Every room held a story, every whisper a memory, and the asylum watched, catalogued, and waited. I was not yet fully a part of its history, but I could sense the inevitability. The echoes of the past were patient. They would follow me, shape me, and mark me. And I understood with a creeping certainty that the longer I stayed, the deeper I would sink into their unending recollection. I found the records room at the far end of the east wing, tucked behind a door so heavy and thick it seemed meant to keep something inside rather than out. The hinges creaked as I pushed it open, the sound stretching down the empty corridor behind me. Inside, rows of metal cabinets rose toward the ceiling, their surfaces rusted and pitted, locks broken or hanging loosely. Dust lay thick over everything, a pale blanket that made the air heavy, and a faint, almost sweetish odor lingered like old paper and antiseptic, mixed with something else I could not name. I ran my hand across a drawer handle, feeling the rough metal beneath my fingers. The drawer resisted slightly, then gave way with a slow, grinding sound. Inside were files stacked haphazardly, folders yellowed and brittle with age. I pulled one out carefully, opening it to the first page. The handwriting was meticulous, neat, almost clinical, describing a patient whose name I will never remember, though the details are still vivid in my mind. Treatments, medications, schedules, all recorded with a precision that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the wing outside. As I read, the words took on a life of their own. Notes about patients who refused meals, who screamed in the night, who did not respond to therapy filled the pages. The tone was cold, detached, clinical, but something else lingered beneath the ink. A subtle thread of cruelty, or perhaps indifference, wound through the lines, like the quiet hum of something unseen pressing against the edges of my perception. I could almost hear the faint cries of the patients, lost in the margins of the documents, trapped in ink and paper long after their voices had ceased. Some files were more disturbing than others. One described a young woman, barely in her 20s, subjected to treatments that were experimental and painful. Electrodes attached to her head, long hours in a dimly lit room, medications designed to suppress not symptoms but personality. The notes spoke clinically, almost proudly, of her progress, though every word reeked of horror. I set the folder down briefly, trying to shake the unease that pressed into my chest, but the air seemed to thicken, the shadows in the corners of the room growing slightly darker. I moved to another drawer, pulling out more files. Patient after patient, name after name, each a story frozen in time, a life meticulously cataloged and then discarded. Some died suddenly, their cause marked simply as unexplained or complications, though the details hinted at something more sinister. The building seemed to respond to my presence, the faint sound of papers rustling as if moved by invisible hands. I told myself it was the wind, though there was no breeze, and still, I could feel the weight of countless eyes upon me. As I continued reading, the line between fact and imagination began to blur. Notes that once seemed clear and clinical began to feel like suggestions, leaving spaces where my mind filled in horrors. I imagined the cries in the hallways, the patient's despair, the experiments conducted in cold, windowless rooms. I imagined the staff watching, indifferent or perhaps complicit, as lives were reshaped, broken, and sometimes extinguished. The asylum was not merely a building. It was a record of human suffering, preserved in paper, wood, and shadow. I came across a file that chilled me more than any other. It was older, the paper nearly crumbling, ink faded to a ghostly gray. The patient was described in vague terms, a man with no name, only initials. The notes were strange, fragmented, sometimes almost nonsensical, but a pattern emerged. Disappearances, sudden illnesses, mentions of voices heard at night, shadows moving in corners where no light fell. The final page was incomplete, torn, as though someone had deliberately tried to erase the conclusion. I ran my fingers over the jagged edge, and for a moment I felt a pull, as if the story itself reached for me, wanting to be remembered. The deeper I delved, the more the room seemed to shift around me. The walls grew closer, the air heavier, and faint sounds. Soft footsteps, distant murmurs, the scraping of chairs across floors filled the space. I told myself it was the building settling, my mind reacting to the weight of the histories I had uncovered, but part of me knew better. The asylum retained memory. The walls, the floors, the papers. They remembered every scream, every cry, every soul that had been cataloged and lost. I pulled another folder at random. This one detailed a patient who had been resistant to treatment, a man described as uncooperative. The notes chronicled his reactions to medication, his attempts to escape, the staff's repeated interventions. The last entry was abrupt, patient unaccounted for, investigation ongoing. There was no follow-up, no explanation, just a blank space where a life should have been accounted for. I felt a chill creep along my spine, and I could almost hear his footsteps echoing in the corridor outside, soft and deliberate, following me. I paused and looked around the room. The cabinets rose like silent sentinels, their drawers full of lives I could never fully comprehend. Dust motes danced in the fading light from the small, grimy window, catching the edges of the folders and highlighting the careful, meticulous handwriting. Every document held a piece of the past, a fragment of pain preserved. I wondered how many stories I could never read, how many lives had vanished without record, absorbed entirely by the building itself. As I turned to leave, the faintest whisper brushed my ear, a sound so soft I thought I might have imagined it. "Don't leave, not yet," my heart leapt, and I pressed a hand to my chest, steadying my breath. I told myself it was the building or the wind or my imagination. But even as I reasoned it out, I could not shake the feeling that someone was aware of me here, watching me, cataloging me as I had cataloged the lives in the files. The asylum did not let go easily. I stepped back into the hallway, the patient files clutched loosely in my hands. Each step seemed to echo more loudly than before, the walls pressing closer, shadows pooling in unexpected corners. The faint rustle of papers followed me down the corridor, moving as though propelled by invisible fingers. I could almost see them, the ghosts of those whose lives had been documented and discarded, lingering in the spaces I now occupied. The whispers continued, not always words, sometimes just a low, unintelligible murmur. My mind began to fill the gaps, imagining the scenes described in the files, the screams muffled by walls, the cold stares of doctors, the patient's fear and confusion. I felt a strange kinship with them, a shared sense of being observed and cataloged. The line between the living and the dead seemed to blur here, each echo in the hallway a reminder that the past was never truly gone. I paused outside a door marked record storage, heavier than any I had seen, its lock long since broken. The room beyond was dark, filled with the faint scent of mildew and old paper. I imagined the cabinets inside, full of folders, full of stories, full of memories that the building had absorbed and would not release. I wondered if the building itself was sentient, patient, and deliberate, keeping the records alive even as their owners had vanished. I set the files down on a dusty table and ran a hand over them, brushing away loose dust. I realized then that I could not leave yet. There was more to see, more to understand, though I could not say why. The asylum had drawn me in, and I was now part of its memory. Each folder I touched, each page I read, tethered me further to its history, and I could feel the weight of countless unseen eyes upon me. I left the records room slowly, each step measured, the patient files still clutched loosely. The corridor ahead seemed longer, the shadows deeper, and the air colder. Faint whispers followed, almost conversational, as if the building itself were attempting to speak. I felt both curiosity and fear intertwined, a thread that pulled me forward. I could not yet leave. I could not yet abandon the echoes of the past that had begun to weave themselves into my own presence. The asylum had shown me only a fraction of its memory, yet I felt its depth, its reach, and its patient, waiting awareness. Every sound, every shadow, every whisper was a reminder this place remembered. It cataloged everything, and now it remembered me. The air grew colder as I approached the last corridor, the faint hum of silence stretching endlessly before me. It was narrower here, the walls closer, almost as if the building itself were compressing space to test my resolve. The floor creaked beneath my weight, each step echoing softly, a reminder that I was alone, or at least I should have been. I reached the final door, the one at the very end, farthest from the entrance. It was different from the others, heavier, reinforced with iron straps, its lock long since rusted and broken. But despite its decay, it carried a sense of purpose, as though it had been designed to keep something in or to keep something out. I paused, pressing a hand to the cold surface. The metal was icy, biting through my sleeve. A faint vibration ran along the door, subtle but noticeable, almost like a heartbeat. My mind raced, imagining what could lie beyond. The whispers I had followed through the asylum until now seemed to gather here, their tone sharper, more urgent, though still impossibly soft. Do not enter, do not open. I couldn't be sure if the voice was real or my imagination, but it pressed against me like a living weight. Finally, I pushed the door. It moved slowly, groaning under its own rust, revealing a room that seemed untouched by time. The air was heavy, almost viscous, filled with a scent I could not name, part mildew, part something acrid, something that reminded me faintly of burnt paper. Shadows pooled along the edges of the room, and a faint dust motes floated like tiny, ghostly dancers in the dim light from a single, grimy window. Inside, the room was small but packed with objects, each arranged as if in careful preservation. A single desk sat at the center, papers stacked neatly on its surface. Filing cabinets lined the walls, closed tightly. On the desk, a small, locked box rested, its metal surface dulled by age. I could feel it almost radiating attention, demanding that I notice it, demanding that I approach. I stepped closer, my fingers brushing the box. A sudden chill ran down my spine, as though the room itself exhaled a breath meant only for me. I hesitated, heart hammering. Every instinct screamed caution, yet my curiosity had drawn me this far. The whispers seemed to pulse in the corners of my mind, a rhythm that matched my own heartbeat, urging me, testing me, guiding me. I lifted the box carefully. It was surprisingly light. The lock fell away easily, almost too easily, as if it had been waiting for me. Inside, I found a diary, its cover worn, the leather cracked and dry. The pages smelled faintly of old paper and dust, and when I opened it, I realized it had been written over decades, entries layered one over the other, some in faded ink, some nearly illegible. This was the asylum's secret, a record not of patience alone, but of the people who had controlled it, the staff, the overseers, and perhaps something else entirely. The first entries were straightforward, written by someone with a clinical tone, detailing daily operations, patient behaviors, minor incidents. But as I read further, the writing shifted. Entries grew fragmented, disjointed, paranoid. They spoke of shadows in the hallways that moved without explanation, voices that whispered in empty rooms, memories that were not their own. One entry described a patient who had vanished during the night, and then the next entry described the same patient as if still present, as if the writer could not reconcile absence and reality. A chill ran through me. I could feel the building around me shift, pressing in, observing. The diary was not merely a collection of records, it was a conduit, a repository for the thoughts, fears, and obsessions of everyone who had worked and suffered here. Reading it, I could almost feel their minds brushing against mine, a subtle, persistent weight pressing into my thoughts. The entries became more surreal. One spoke of a patient who claimed to see events before they happened, visions of things that had yet to occur. Another described whispers that instructed certain actions, subtle and persistent, that staff and patients alike could not resist. The diary's author began to question their own perception, nodding that rooms had changed overnight, hallways extended, doors that were once open now vanished. By the final pages, the entries were almost indecipherable, scribbles over earlier words, notes torn and folded over. As if the writer had tried to erase something, hide a truth too dangerous to face. I could feel my pulse quicken, a subtle anxiety threading through my calm breathing. The asylum had already shown me fragments of its history, but here, in this room, the full weight pressed down. Every whisper, every echo, every shadow I had sensed over the past hours seemed to converge here. It was not merely a building with a past. It was a place that remembered, that held memory like a living thing, and now it held mine as well. I set the diary down for a moment, glancing around the room. Shadows pooled in the corners, unnaturally thick, almost solid. I felt a subtle movement just beyond my vision, but when I turned, nothing was there. My mind tried to rationalize, insisting it was fatigue, imagination, or the weight of the files I had read earlier. But I could not shake the certainty that something watched, something aware, something that had noticed me long before I had noticed the diary. I returned to the desk, opening more papers, trying to piece together what had happened here. Reports of deaths without explanation, treatments without consent, patients recorded as present and absent simultaneously. The more I read, the more reality blurred. The asylum had absorbed the histories of those who lived and died here, and in doing so, it reshaped them. Perhaps it was the building, perhaps it was the lingering minds, or perhaps it was something I could not name at all. I felt my own memories begin to blur, merging faintly with the diary's contents. For a moment, I could almost see myself walking these halls not as an intruder, but as one of the recorded. The shadows were not just shadows. They were fragments of people, fragments of thought, fragments of memory, lingering and observing, pressing against the fragile boundary between then and now. The final entry in the diary was different. It was written in a hurried scrawl, the ink smudged as if by trembling hands. It spoke of the asylum itself, describing it not as a building, but as an entity, patient, deliberate, and aware. It knows, it watches, it keeps, and now it knows you. I closed the diary slowly, my hands trembling slightly. The words lingered in my mind, a subtle echo that would not dissipate. As I stepped back from the desk, I realized I could no longer fully trust my senses. The shadows in the corners seemed closer, thicker. The whispers that had followed me for hours now pressed into my thoughts more insistently, urging, reminding, warning. I felt the building's presence pressing against my consciousness, patient and inevitable. I was not just an observer here. I was part of its memory now, cataloged alongside the files, the whispers, the shadows. I left the locked room slowly, the diary in my hands, but the weight of what I had uncovered pressed heavily on me. The corridor beyond seemed longer than before, the walls pressing closer, the shadows darker. The whispers followed, insistent but soft, threading through my mind as I moved, echoing in rhythm with my heartbeat. Every step reminded me that the asylum did not release its memories easily, and that those who entered its depths were never truly separate from the histories it had recorded. As I paused at the top of the stairs leading back to the main hall, I looked once more toward the locked memories I had just left. The door seemed smaller now, less imposing, but I knew better. It had been a threshold, a barrier not just to a room, but to understanding the depths of this place. And I understood with a creeping certainty that the asylum's memories would continue to follow me, even as I left the room behind. I had arrived at Blackwater Lake in the late afternoon, when the sun had begun to sink behind the far tree line, casting long shadows that stretched over the still water. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of pine and wet earth, a mixture that was familiar yet slightly unsettling. I had chosen this spot for its remoteness, a place far from the hum of traffic and the chatter of other campers, hopping for solitude and perhaps a sense of clarity after weeks that had felt heavy and restless. The lake itself was eerily still, the surface smooth like glass. Not a ripple, not a single movement to break its mirror-like calm. The reflection of the trees on the opposite shore was so precise that for a moment I had to remind myself which way was up. As I unpacked my small tent and set up my campfire, I noticed the mist beginning to roll in. It was slow at first, almost casual, drifting over the water in a thin veil, curling around the trunks of the trees and reaching across the campsite. By the time the sun disappeared entirely, the fog had thickened, settling low over the water and creeping toward the shore where I had pitched my tent. The lake vanished beneath a gray haze, and even the sound of the forest seemed muffled. My footsteps, which had been crisp on the soft earth, were now swallowed almost immediately, leaving only a faint, hollow echo. I paused and listened, hearing nothing beyond the occasional rustle of leaves, and even that seemed distant, as though filtered through layers of mist. I stepped closer to the water's edge, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and unease. The lake had always seemed tranquil in pictures I had seen online, but here, surrounded by the thickening fog, it felt different. Something about the silence pressed against me, subtle yet insistent, like a weight across my chest. I squinted, trying to make out the opposite shore, but it had disappeared entirely. The trees, the rocks, the small docks that jutted into the water, they were gone, swallowed by a gray expanse that moved almost imperceptibly, like a living thing. I set up my campfire, the flames throwing pale, flickering light into the fog. It didn't penetrate far. The mist seemed to absorb it, leaving the perimeter around the fire dim and uncertain. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, shifting with the wind, or so I told myself. The air smelled faintly of wet moss, but beneath it there was something else, faintly metallic, faintly sharp, that I couldn't place. My mind whispered that it was nothing, just my imagination, yet my instincts prickled with unease. I ate a simple meal, chewing quietly and listening to the lake. Usually evenings by a fire were filled with sound, the splash of fish, the calls of birds settling for the night, the soft lapping of water. But here there was only silence, an oppressive stillness that seemed almost intentional. I caught myself glancing at the fog, half expecting something to emerge, but there was nothing. Just the pale gray veil, moving slowly, curling, stretching, almost breathing. As darkness settled fully, the mist thickened further, wrapping around the trees and the shoreline. I thought I heard a faint sound, something soft like water lapping, but irregular, hesitant, as if something beneath the surface was aware of my presence. I froze, the fork in my hand hovering midair. There it was again, subtle but unmistakable, a ripple, not caused by wind, moving against the calm of the lake. I strained to see through the fog, my heart quickening slightly, but there was nothing. The lake was smooth again, as if nothing had disturbed it. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the unease. It had been a long week, my mind tense and tired. The shadows, the fog, my own imagination. They could have easily conspired to create shapes and sounds where none existed. Still, I felt a subtle pull, a curiosity that I couldn't ignore. I stood and walked slowly to the water's edge, the soft ground damp beneath my boots. The mist swirled around my legs, curling upward like fingers, and I felt a cold draft rise from the lake. I leaned slightly forward, peering into the gray expanse. For a moment, I thought I saw movement beneath the surface, subtle distortions that rippled outward. My breath caught. I took a cautious step closer, then stopped, realizing the bank sloped into the water more sharply than I had expected. I could see the dark outline of the lakebed faintly through the mist, but nothing moved except the fog itself. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I returned to my fire, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as though unseen eyes lingered just beyond the veil. The mist had a way of reshaping the landscape, turning familiar shapes into unfamiliar ones, and every tree, every rock, every shadow seemed charged with potential meaning. I told myself to focus on the fire, to listen to nothing but the crackle of the wood and the faint pop of sparks as they rose into the night. Yet even then, I sensed the lake itself was aware, patient and deliberate, holding secrets beneath its still surface. Time became difficult to measure. The darkness, the fog, the quiet, all blended into a single, unbroken sensation. I found myself watching the lake, tracing shapes in the mist, and wondering if my mind was filling in patterns that weren't there. I imagined silhouettes moving beneath the water, the hint of faces in the fog, but I dismissed them quickly. Still, the sense of unease lingered, pressing gently against my mind, insistent and subtle, like a whisper I could not fully hear. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, the fire reduced to embers that glowed faintly. I lay on my sleeping pad, listening to the lake, listening to the mist, and imagining shapes that may not exist. The fog pressed against the thin canvas of the tent, muffling the outside world, creating a cocoon of quiet that was almost too complete. I closed my eyes, but I could not sleep immediately. The lake, the mist, the silence, they demanded attention, subtle and patient, and my mind replayed every ripple, every whisper, every faint outline that might have been movement. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes, I could not tell. The lake remained still, but the mist thickened, curling closer, pressing into the shoreline, moving as if it had a rhythm of its own. I could almost feel it tracing my tent's shape, brushing along the edges, settling across the canvas. I told myself I was imagining it, that the solitude, the darkness, the isolation, all of it, was bending perception. Yet even as I reasoned it out, I felt an undeniable pull from the lake, a weight pressing toward me, patient and silent, waiting for the dawn I was not sure would come. By the time the first faint light of morning began to touch the mist, I felt hollow, as if the lake had absorbed part of me in the night. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing a glassy surface that reflected the pale sunrise like a mirror. No ripples, no disturbances, no sign that anything had moved. Yet I could not shake the memory of the subtle movements I had imagined, or had I imagined them. The sensation lingered, an almost tactile reminder that the lake and the fog held secrets I had only begun to perceive. I packed my gear slowly, reluctant to leave, reluctant to break the connection I had felt with Blackwater. The lake remained still, patient and silent, watching, and I knew with a creeping certainty that part of me would remain as well, tied to the mist, to the water, to the quiet weight of something I could not fully name. The morning mist had lifted slightly when I stepped outside my tent, but the lake was still veiled in a gray haze that clung to the surface like a thin curtain. The air smelled damp and earthy, with a hint of something sour I couldn't identify. Each breath I took felt heavier than the last, as though the fog itself weighed on my lungs. I tried to shake off the lingering unease from the previous night, telling myself that the lake was still and quiet because it had nothing to reveal, nothing to hide. But even as I reassured myself, a small, nagging part of my mind refused to be calmed. I walked toward the shoreline, my boots sinking slightly into the wet sand. Each step made a soft squelching sound, absorbed quickly by the fog, and for a moment it felt as though the world had shrunk down to just me and the thin ribbon of earth beneath my feet. I scanned the water, half expecting to see ripples, movement, or some sign of life, but the lake remained unnervingly smooth, a perfect mirror for the gray sky above. And then I heard it. A soft sound, distant at first, almost imperceptible, a footstep light and careful on damp ground. My pulse quickened. I froze, straining my ears. The fog muffled everything, making distance impossible to judge. Another step followed, then a pause, then a faint scuffing sound. It was impossible to tell where it came from. It could have been the wind moving the branches, the soil settling, or it could have been someone or something watching me. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining it, that the night's isolation had left my mind oversensitive. Yet the sounds continued. Footsteps, now slower, deliberate, retreating as though circling me, approaching and then moving away. My eyes darted through the mist, catching flickers of shapes just beyond the edges of perception. Shadows that could have been birds or tree branches or the fog itself. They moved unpredictably, appearing only in the corner of my vision, disappearing when I tried to focus directly on them. I took a cautious step back, my boots pressing into the damp sand, and the footsteps followed, closer, then further. Each movement felt like a heartbeat, a rhythm synced with my own. I wanted to call out, to demand to see who or what was there, but the sound of my own voice felt intrusive, harsh against the quiet, delicate tension of the morning. So I stayed silent, letting my mind follow the pattern, letting it trace the footsteps through the fog. A sudden thought crossed my mind: the lake. The water had seemed almost alive in the night, reflective in ways that felt unnatural. Was it connected to this? Could the fog, the water, the shadows all be part of the same thing, subtly aware, subtly moving around me? I shook my head, trying to dismiss the notion. Logic told me it was just the combination of isolation and the lingering tension from the previous night. Still, the unease clung to me, coiling tightly in my chest. I moved closer to the tree line, hoping that by leaving the immediate shoreline I might get a clearer perspective. The forest edge loomed faintly in the mist, dark and solid in contrast to the gray blur of the lake. Every tree was a tower, every branch a finger pointing toward me. I stepped carefully, listening. The footsteps had not ceased. They continued, slow, deliberate, retreating, approaching. I couldn't determine direction or distance. Each pause and sound made my skin prickle with awareness. Each movement made me feel as though something unseen were studying me, assessing, patient and silent. A shadow flickered to my right. I turned sharply, but there was nothing. Just the fog curling and flowing around the trees. My chest tightened. My hands, slightly clammy, clutched the straps of my backpack. The world felt too still, too quiet. The fog moved like water around the trunks of the trees, bending shapes, masking figures, teasing my mind. I could almost imagine faces behind the mist, watching me, waiting for me to slip a step, a word, a thought. I tried to focus on sound alone. The footsteps were subtle, precise, never leaving a clear trail. Occasionally, they stopped entirely, replaced by a faint shuffling, almost like someone dragging a hand across damp leaves. And then, when I thought I had pinpointed the direction, the sounds would vanish entirely, leaving only the silence of the forest and the soft lapping of water against the shore. It was impossible to determine what was real, what was imagined, and that uncertainty wrapped itself around my mind like the fog itself. I found a large fallen log near the edge of the trees and lowered myself onto it, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The lake lay ahead, vast and gray, its surface flat and unbroken. The mist clung to its edges, hiding whatever lay beyond. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening. The footsteps persisted, sometimes faint, almost imperceptible, sometimes closer, sharper, more deliberate. They were never continuous, always intermittent, teasing like something testing my attention. The forest seemed to breathe around me. Branches shifted slightly, leaves brushed together softly, and the fog swirled as though moved by some unseen current. I could feel a presence, not threatening in the way that would make my chest constrict, but patient, deliberate, aware. Something had noticed me, and even if it were only my imagination, the thought was unnerving. My mind traced patterns in the sound, tried to predict movement, but there was no pattern. Only repetition and pause, approach and retreat, all within the same gray silence. I opened my eyes, scanning the lake once more. The fog had thickened, curling into denser, heavier shapes. The water reflected the gray sky faintly, but it was almost impossible to discern where water ended and fog began. A sudden motion at the periphery of my vision made me flinch. A figure, perhaps, or a shadow shaped like one. I focused sharply and it vanished. Just the fog. Just the movement of wind over the water. I told myself this, over and over, and yet the skin along my arms remained taut with unease. I shifted my position on the log, trying to maintain calm. The fog, the lake, the shadows, they pressed on my attention insistently but subtly. I realized I had been holding my breath, straining to hear and see, trying to pin down the source of the sounds. When I exhaled, the mist seemed to lean closer, curling toward me as if aware of my movements. The footsteps stopped. A silence fell that was almost unbearable, heavy and expectant. Then faintly from somewhere far off, I heard a sound that made my stomach tighten, a soft splash. Not a large movement, not a stone thrown in, but a subtle disturbance in the lake itself. I squinted through the fog, trying to locate it, but the mist obscured everything. The splash repeated, irregular, distant yet distinct, and I realized that the footsteps had returned, closer now, moving along the shoreline, circling, observing. My mind raced, trying to reconcile logic with perception. The lake had been still, the mist had been empty, and yet there was movement. I stood slowly, feeling the damp earth beneath my boots. The fog shifted slightly with the breeze, and the footsteps followed, careful, deliberate, patient. I knew I should return to my tent, should retreat to the safety of the fire, but a strange curiosity rooted me in place. Something in the movement, the rhythm, the uncertainty, drew me forward, urging me to see more, to understand what I could not name. I walked slowly along the edge of the trees, the lake to my left, the mist curling and twisting with every step. The sounds of footsteps and splashes persisted, sometimes retreating, sometimes approaching, but always there, threading through the silence like a living thing. Shadows flickered at the edge of perception, shapes that might have been trees or branches or something else entirely. I felt the weight of being observed but never confronted. The fog held its secrets close, teasing me, testing me. Hours or perhaps only minutes passed. The lake remained still, the fog thick and curling, and the footsteps continued their quiet rhythm, ever present but elusive. I finally returned to my tent, heart pounding, senses sharpened by isolation and uncertainty. I lay on my sleeping pad, staring at the ceiling of the canvas, listening to the faint, intermittent sounds outside. The mist pressed close to the tent walls, whispering over the canvas in ways I could not fully understand. Even as I drifted into restless awareness, the footsteps and splashes continued, a subtle accompaniment to the quiet night. And I knew, with a certainty that was both chilling and inexplicable, that the lake and the fog were aware of me, patient and deliberate, waiting for the next movement, the next breath, the next moment I might reveal myself. The fog had thinned slightly by midday, though the lake remained shrouded in that unsettling gray mist that seemed to swallow sound and light alike. I had stayed near the tent for a while, packing the shoreline in hesitant loops, listening for the soft, almost imperceptible footsteps that had haunted the previous morning. The water was still, unnervingly calm, reflecting the pale sky, but something in its silence drew me closer, like a quiet invitation. I noticed the first hints of something unusual as I traced the edge of the lake with my eyes. Near a small inlet, partially hidden by reeds and fog, a structure broke the uniformity of the water. At first I thought it was driftwood, maybe a log or a fallen tree trunk, but as I squinted the outlines sharpened into something far more deliberate. The roof of a cabin, old, dark wood, worn and sagging, its walls submerged, only the top half of the roof protruding above the surface. I felt a strange pull toward it, as though the lake itself were nudging me closer. Each step through the shallow water at the edge sent tiny ripples across the mirror-like surface. My boots sank slightly into the soft mud beneath, and I felt the familiar tension rise in my chest. The cabin was small, perhaps no more than a single room, but even from this distance, I could see that it had been abandoned for decades. The wood was blackened with age, warped and cracked, the shingles missing in places, exposing the interior to the sky. I knelt at the edge of the water, peering inside. The cabin's interior was murky, waterlogged, filled with debris and mud. Yet among the ruin I could make out objects, shapes that hinted at a domestic life abruptly halted. A chair tipped over, half submerged. A small wooden table cracked and bowed. A few indiscernible items scattered across the floor, trapped under the water. The sense of abandonment pressed on me, heavy and suffocating, and I could almost imagine the lives that had once filled this space. I decided to move closer. Wading through the shallow water was slow and careful. Each step disturbed the surface, sending concentric rings outward, dissolving into the fog. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. As I approached the cabin, I noticed a faint glint of metal, perhaps rusted, protruding from the submerged floor. My fingers brushed against it, and I realized it was a small tin box, corroded by years of water exposure. I lifted it carefully, trying to avoid further damage. The lid was warped, but it opened with some effort, revealing a handful of yellowed papers, brittle and delicate. I pulled them out, careful not to tear them. The papers were a collection of letters and notes, hastily written, edges frayed by water and age. The handwriting was small, precise, intimate, as though each word carried weight beyond the simple sentences they formed. I read the first few lines, and my stomach tightened. The letters spoke of daily life, of small arguments, of hopes and minor joys, but always with an undercurrent of worry. There were mentions of illness, of strange noises at night, of neighbors who had stopped visiting, of a growing sense of unease. And then the tone shifted. The final letters were almost frantic. The writer spoke of someone watching, someone always at the edge of sight, following, waiting. There were mentions of threats that could not be understood, of shadows moving in the water, of voices whispering outside the cabin at night. The words were jumbled, erratic, but unmistakable in their fear. I shivered, holding the papers tightly, aware of the thin line between the past and my present curiosity. I set the letters aside and glanced around the cabin again. The roof was warped, the walls bent from years of water pressure. But I noticed something odd, small, precise scratches along the door frame, as if someone had tried to climb out or signal from inside. The scratches were old, yes, but their pattern unnerved me. They seemed deliberate, intentional, a silent plea preserved in wood. The idea of a family trapped here, alone and terrified, sent a chill through me. The water sloshed gently against the cabin's walls, whispering in its own language. Each movement of the fog seemed deliberate, curling around the cabin as if keeping secrets hidden beneath its gray folds. I imagined the family, long gone, submerged with their memories, their voices absorbed by the water, leaving only echoes. My pulse quickened, not from fear alone, but from a strange empathy. The scene felt unbearably intimate, unbearably human. I could almost hear the muffled sounds of a child's laughter, or a mother's soft warning, or the hushed arguments that filled the room before the tragedy. I knelt again, looking into the murky interior. One item caught my attention, a small, waterlogged doll, its fabric faded, its face smudged but recognizable. I held it gingerly, feeling the weight of its silent presence. It was a remnant of innocence, now abandoned, lost to time and water. The symbolism was hard to ignore, the idea that the small, personal things survived even as the lives that made them meaningful had vanished. I felt a pang of sorrow, mingled with the creeping unease that this place seemed not just abandoned, but remembered, holding onto its past like a living thing. I realized then that the fog was no longer simply a veil. It was part of the cabin, part of the tragedy. It moved differently here, thicker, curling more densely over the water, shifting with almost a consciousness of its own. I felt watched, not by a person, but by the weight of history itself, pressing through the mist and the water, making the present feel unstable. Every ripple, every shadow, seemed to carry a story I could not fully grasp. I set the doll and letters down carefully, trying to maintain a distance from the intensity of the past. Yet the pull remained. I couldn't leave, not yet. I explored the perimeter of the cabin, wading in shallow water, observing small details. A rusted hinge here, a broken shutter there, remnants of a life paused mid-motion. The longer I lingered, the more I felt the sense of urgency, the unfinished business of those who had lived here. The water seemed almost to breathe, expanding and contracting around me, as though the lake itself remembered, held onto the echoes of the sunken cabin. By late afternoon, I reluctantly began retreating, pulling myself back towards solid ground. The fog thickened again, obscuring the cabin entirely from view, and I realized with a start that the lake now seemed to stretch endlessly, without edge or boundary. I could still feel the cabin beneath the water, its presence pressing at the edge of my mind. The letters, the doll, the scratches, all tangible pieces of a family lost to time, had left a mark that I couldn't ignore. Returning to my tent, I sat in silence, listening to the subtle movement of water against the shore. The memory of the sunken cabin lingered, vivid and oppressive. I imagined the family inside, their lives abruptly halted, their fear captured in the warped wood, the waterlogged papers, the fog curling above the lake. I tried to calm my mind, to rationalize the scene, to treat it as history and not presence. But the lake, the fog, the soft whispers of memory, they refused to be ignored. Even now, writing these notes, I can feel the pull of the sunken cabin. I can hear the faint creak of boards underwater, the subtle echo of footsteps, the whisper of voices long gone. It is as if the lake preserves their story, folds it into the mist, and waits for someone to remember, to see, to acknowledge. I am that witness, though I am unsure if I want to be. The fog thickens outside my tent once more, curling across the surface of the water, and I know that even as night falls, the cabin and its tragic past remain, silent but ever present, beneath the still gray water. Night had fallen over Blackwater Lake, though the fog remained thick and unbroken, curling across the surface like some living, slow-moving veil. I sat at the water's edge, the small campfire I had lit earlier reduced to glowing embers, barely cutting through the gray haze. The lake itself was still, almost unnaturally calm, yet I could feel a subtle vibration through the mud beneath me, as if the water sensed my presence, acknowledged my attention, and waited. I leaned back slightly, staring into the black mirror of the lake, and that's when I first noticed it, movement in the reflection that did not match reality. The trees behind me swayed in gentle windless patterns, yet in the water, the shapes bent differently, rippling with an almost sentient grace. My own reflection wavered, distorted beyond the natural flicker of firelight. I blinked slowly, trying to convince myself that it was only fatigue, only my mind playing tricks. But the more I stared, the more I realized the lake was observing me as much as I was observing it. A chill ran down my spine as I shifted my gaze along the surface. The water reflected the fog in unusual patterns, curling in tight spirals, breaking and reforming. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of shapes, figures perhaps, standing just beyond the veil. Their forms were fleeting, impossible to fully focus on, like memories half remembered in a dream. I wanted to call out, to speak to them, but the words stuck in my throat. I could hear the faint lapping of water against the shore, but it was oddly muted, as though the lake itself was controlling the sound, letting only what it wanted reach me. I remembered the sunken cabin, its roof barely visible above the water, the letters and the doll I had seen earlier. It felt as though the lake was linking me to that past, drawing my thoughts into its reflections. Each ripple seemed to echo fragments of stories I could not piece together. I saw flashes of the family who had lived there, or perhaps imagined them. A child's laughter distorted by water, a mother's voice whispering warnings, a father packing the cabin's floor, restless and fearful. The lake held these memories, pressing them to the surface, offering them to me in silent, haunting glimpses. As I sat, transfixed, I noticed movement closer to me along the shoreline. Not on the ground, not in the fog, but in the water itself. Shadows flickered beneath the surface, moving against the natural pull of the current, hovering as if waiting. My heart began to quicken, but I forced myself to remain calm. It was easier to see the lake as alive than to see it as malevolent, yet the feeling of being watched, of being tested, was undeniable. Each ripple, each subtle shift of the water seemed to respond to my thoughts, reflecting my fear and curiosity back at me. I leaned forward, fingertips brushing the surface. The water was cold, almost shockingly so, sending a shiver up my arm. I touched the lake again lightly, and the surface immediately rippled in response. Shapes formed briefly, like outlines of people I could not recognize, figures bending unnaturally, hands reaching upward without reason. The lake seemed to remember the sunken cabin, the tragedy that had occurred, and it mirrored it now, fragmentary and distorted. I pulled my hand back quickly, unnerved by the intimate connection I felt. The night deepened and the fog thickened with it. The embers of my fire glowed faintly, barely illuminating the shoreline. I noticed more reflections, subtle at first, then more pronounced. Shadows of trees that I knew stood straight now leaned unnaturally, converging over the water, forming archways or even faces. My mind strained to make sense of what I saw. Was it the lake, or was it my imagination projecting fear onto the fog? The lines blurred. I wanted to believe in rational explanations, yet each flicker, each impossible reflection insisted otherwise. A subtle sound drew my attention. At first I thought it was my own breathing or the soft lapping of water, but then I realized it was a rhythm, almost deliberate, like footsteps moving just beneath the surface. No disturbance of mud, no splash, yet the sound traveled across the water toward me, then retreated, leaving only silence. I froze, every nerve alert. I wanted to move back, but the pull of the lake kept me rooted, as if the water itself demanded that I witness what it held. I leaned closer, resting my chin on my hands, peering into the black surface. The reflections were no longer passive, they seemed aware of me. I saw shapes that mimicked my own movements with subtle delay, warped in impossible ways. My arm lifted, and the reflection's arm twisted slightly before following. My own face stared back at me, but its expression was subtly different. Eyes wider, mouth tighter, a shadow of tension that I did not feel in my real body. I recoiled slightly, but could not look away. The lake seemed to respond to my thoughts now. The deeper I delved into fear, the more the reflections twisted, echoing my curiosity and anxiety. I saw the cabin again, submerged beneath the water, more vivid than ever. The roof seemed to float higher in the reflection than in reality. I glimpsed the interior through the water's surface, faintly illuminated, and saw the chair upright, the doll sitting on the table. The letters from the tin box appeared as well, stacked neatly, their edges sharp and new. The lake was telling me a story, reconstructing the past in impossible detail, yet with subtle deviations that made me question whether what I saw was true or imagined. I realized I was speaking aloud, almost involuntarily. "What happened here?" I whispered, the words dissolving into the fog. The lake answered in silence, but the reflections shifted subtly, as if acknowledging the question. Shadows moved within the water, circling the sunken cabin, swirling like eddies, suggesting the presence of those lost to time. I felt a strange empathy for whatever lingered in the lake, as though understanding their fear and loss made the fog thicker, more tangible around me. Minutes, or was it hours, passed in this way, me sitting at the edge of the lake, staring into impossible reflections. My sense of time blurred, each ripple, each shadow feeding a creeping tension. I tried to rationalize: fatigue, imagination, isolation. Yet rational thoughts were swallowed by the fog. I felt a subtle pressure, a suggestion that the lake was alive, aware, and in some small, incomprehensible way interacting with me. Every movement of my body seemed to echo back from the water in warped form. Every thought mirrored and twisted. Finally, I drew back, trembling slightly, my hands away from the surface. The reflection stabilized somewhat, though the fog remained, curling and curling over the water. I realized I could not remain here forever. The lake's story had been told, but not completed. Its memory lingered, patient and deliberate, waiting for someone else to come and watch, to see, to feel its reflections. I stepped back to the tent, the embers of my fire long cold, the night pressing in around me. Even at a distance, I could feel the lake's pull, subtle and constant, whispering stories I could never fully comprehend. I wrote these notes carefully, trying to preserve the sensations of that night, the intimate connection with a place that felt alive yet tragic. Even now, I can see the reflections in my mind's eye, the subtle shifts of the fog, the impossible movements of the water. The lake is patient, quiet, and it waits, holding its stories just beneath the surface, where memory and reality blur. I cannot leave without acknowledging it, without knowing that its presence is as much part of me as I am part of it now. And yet, even as I sit, I sense it watching, remembering, responding. The fog curls over the lake like a protective shroud, hiding the sunken cabin and its secrets, but the reflections remain, always shifting, always suggesting, always hinting at truths I cannot fully grasp. I close my eyes for a moment, letting the cold damp of the night seep into my skin and feel the subtle movement beneath me. Water, memory, reflection, all intertwined. I know that I will dream of this lake and its impossible reflections for a long time to come. I arrived at the edge of the old railway line just as the last light of day had surrendered to dusk. The forest around me seemed to hold its breath, and the tracks stretched ahead, vanishing into the darkness. I had driven hours to see this place, a forgotten line that once carried travelers through the hills, now abandoned and almost entirely reclaimed by nature. The rails gleamed faintly in the dying light, wet with evening dew, and the wooden sleepers beneath them were swollen and cracked, their surfaces moss-covered and slick. The air was heavy and still. I took a step forward, boots crunching softly against the gravel and leaves, and felt the faint vibration of the tracks beneath my feet, though no train had passed in decades. My own heartbeat seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet. I paused, listening, hoping to hear the distant clatter of wheels or the faint whistle of a train in the night. But there was only silence, thick and deliberate. I had prepared for this trip with maps, old photographs, and a collection of railway journals. I knew the history, stations abandoned without ceremony, signals rusting in place, timetables torn and lost. Yet standing here, I realized how incomplete the history was. The track itself seemed to exist outside of time, suspended in a quiet moment that no longer belonged to anyone. And as I walked, I began to notice subtleties, small details that set me on edge. A shadow that shifted slightly despite the steady twilight, a sudden rustle in the undergrowth, the feeling that I was not entirely alone. The further I went along the line, the more the forest seemed to close in. Trees leaned toward the tracks as though listening, their branches scratching against each other, making noises that might have been wind or something else entirely. I stopped again, this time catching a faint metallic sound behind me. Not the creak of the rails, but something sharper, a fleeting clink that could have been a dropped tool or perhaps a small animal. I told myself it was nothing, yet my pulse quickened. I had expected silence, but not this particular kind of stillness, which felt observant and strangely patient. I knelt by one of the wooden sleepers, tracing a finger along its damp surface. The wood was splintered in places, but the grain was almost alive, patterns of age and rot twisting like veins. I imagined the trains that had passed here long ago, the rhythmic pounding of wheels on iron, the whistles echoing across valleys, the laughter of passengers pressed against the glass of their carriages. And yet now, there was no life. Only the whisper of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, and the faint, unplaceable sounds that seemed to drift from the shadows beside me. As I continued, I found remnants of the past scattered along the track. Rusted spikes, broken lanterns, and fragments of paper that had resisted decay despite decades of exposure. I picked up one of the yellowed sheets, careful not to crumble it, and found faint handwriting, nearly illegible. A schedule, a note, perhaps even a diary entry. The words were fragmented, lines crossed out, sentences incomplete. I shivered as I read, not entirely from the chill of the evening. The handwriting felt like a trace of someone who had been here, whose life had brushed briefly against this line, now gone and almost forgotten. The further I walked, the more I noticed patterns in the shadows, shapes that should have been nothing. Fallen branches, rocks, hollows in the earth seemed to arrange themselves as if deliberately. My mind tried to rationalize it. Optical illusions fatigued, the effect of a long drive and quiet anticipation. Yet the feeling persisted. Something was watching, though not in the sense of a conscious being. It was as if the abandoned track itself had awareness, a slow, deliberate patience that weighed upon me, pressing into the rhythm of my own footsteps. I came across the remains of a small platform, partially collapsed and overtaken by ivy. Rusted railings jutted at odd angles, and the boards beneath were rotting, sagging under decades of neglect. I stepped carefully onto it, listening as the wood groaned beneath my weight. From this vantage point, I could see the tracks stretch into the darkness, fading into black where the trees converged. I imagined the engines that had stopped here, the passengers disembarking into the chill of a morning that would never come again. And then, almost immediately, I felt a pressure in my chest, a tightening of the space around me, as if the station itself remembered the people it had once held and resented their absence. I crouched to examine a rusted lantern lying on its side. The glass was cracked, the metal corroded, but I could still make out the faint trace of soot inside. It struck me that someone had been here last, long ago, and that memory had been frozen into the object. I could almost see the figure who had carried it, moving with careful steps along the platform, unaware that their presence would dissolve into history. The realization sent a subtle shiver down my spine. The track, the platform, the objects, they were all witnesses, holding onto traces of lives that no longer existed. As the night deepened, the fog began to creep along the rails. It moved in slow, curling tendrils, obscuring the distance and swallowing the ends of the track. My own reflection in the wet rails was distorted, stretched, and warped, and for a moment I could not distinguish between myself and the shapes in the fog. Every step I took produced soft echoes, bouncing off the trees and returning to me altered, sometimes delayed, sometimes amplified. It was disorienting, the sensation that the track itself was bending reality just enough to make me doubt what I saw and heard. I paused, listening. There was a rhythm now, faint and irregular, the soft clatter of something moving along the rails somewhere far ahead. Not the full weight of a train, just tiny taps like small metal feet against iron. I could not see anyone or anything, yet the sound persisted, approaching and retreating in a pattern I could not predict. My mind raced with possibilities, animals, branches falling, my own imagination. But the deeper instinct whispered something darker, something patient and observing, like the track itself was responding to my presence. I continued forward, boots pressing carefully into the gravel, eyes scanning the fog for movement. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of what might have been a person standing just beyond the veil, or perhaps a figure in the fog that only resembled one. Every time I blinked, it was gone, leaving me alone with the whispering sounds of the track and the shifting mist. I realized I was holding my breath, waiting, and that anticipation was feeding the unease that now clung to me like the damp air. Near an old signal post, the fog thickened to a near impenetrable wall. I could just make out the silhouette of the post, rusted and bent, its light long extinguished. The metal groaned faintly in the breeze, or was it my imagination? The air seemed denser here, heavier, as if memory itself had weight. I crouched to touch the base of the post, feeling the cold, pitted metal under my fingers. It was solid and yet somehow more than metal. It carried the echo of years, of countless trains passing, of people waiting, arriving, departing, and leaving the line behind. And then I heard it, a whisper, soft, almost lost in the rustling of leaves in the distant fog, but there. Not a word I could understand, just a murmur, a sound that brushed against my ear as if traveling along the track itself. I spun slowly, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. The fog was thick, the trees silent, the rails gleaming faintly in the firelight of my mind. I was alone, and yet I was not. I took a step back, almost involuntarily, and the whisper faded, replaced by the familiar sound of my boots against gravel. Yet the sensation remained, a lingering unease that pressed into my chest, a knowledge that the track was more than empty rails and old wood. It remembered, and it waited. I realized then that my fascination, my curiosity, was not entirely mine. The line had drawn me here, and now it held me in its quiet, patient grip, whispering in echoes and shadows, hinting at stories I could not yet comprehend. I stayed there for a long while, letting the fog and the sound settle over me, letting the track speak in its subtle, insistent way. Eventually, I backed away slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile balance of night and silence. As I reached the edge of the abandoned track, I glanced back once more. The rails disappeared into the mist, the forest holding the line like a secret, and I understood that what I had encountered was only the beginning. The track was patient, and I would return, drawn by the quiet insistence of its memory, by the whispers that carried on the wind, by the weight of the past folded into the rails themselves. I stayed by the edge of the tracks longer than I intended, listening to the quiet, letting the fog settle around me. Each rustle of leaves, each snapping twig seemed amplified, like the world had narrowed down to the faint sounds of the abandoned line and the fog that hugged it. It was in that thick, damp air that I first heard it, a faint whistle far off, impossibly distant, and yet unmistakable. At first, I convinced myself it was a train still running somewhere along the line, but the timetable I had studied, the history I had pored over, insisted otherwise. No train had passed here in decades. The tracks were rusted, the signals frozen in place, the stations gone. And yet the sound persisted, low and mournful, like a voice from the past reaching through the fog. I froze, letting the whistle echo around me. It was not continuous. It came in soft bursts, distant and faint, and then disappeared, leaving the night silent once again. My pulse quickened, and I realized I had been holding my breath. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the wind was carrying the sound from far away. Perhaps my mind was playing tricks after hours of driving and wandering these empty tracks. But deep down, I knew it was something else, something deliberate, something aware of me. The whistle returned, slightly closer this time, though I could see nothing in the thick fog. The rails stretched ahead, black and gleaming faintly in the dim moonlight, leading into shadows that seemed impossibly deep. My boots crunched against the gravel as I stepped forward, drawn toward the sound. I reminded myself to be cautious, but there was a compulsion I could not resist, a need to follow the noise and understand what had caused it. I walked slowly, each step measured, ears straining. The whistle came again, faint and broken, almost like someone calling a name I could not hear. There was a rhythm to it, irregular yet intentional, rising and falling as if it were trying to communicate, trying to lead me somewhere. I glanced along the track, hopping for some sign of life or even a reflection of light, but the fog swallowed everything beyond a few feet. The world was reduced to the line beneath me and the sound in the distance. As I walked, I noticed that the shadows around me seemed to move differently. Not with the wind, not with the shifting fog, but with a subtle, deliberate pattern, like something was packing alongside me, hidden just out of sight. I told myself it was only the trick of the fog and the dim light, but the feeling of being followed grew, a gentle pressure at the edge of perception. I tried to speak aloud to break the tension, but my voice felt too loud in the quiet, and I swallowed it back. The whistle came again, this time almost directly ahead, echoing off the trees and hills. It carried a weight, a sorrowful energy that pricked at my chest. I imagined the train that might have passed here long ago, filled with passengers hurrying along their journeys, unaware that their tracks would vanish and the world would forget them. And yet this whistle was different. It was not a sound of travel or haste, but of longing, of something trapped, reaching out from a place that no longer existed. I paused, crouching to touch the rails. The iron was cold beneath my fingers, slick with dew, and I traced the line forward, feeling its vibration, subtle and low. It hummed faintly under my touch as if acknowledging me. The whistle followed, pulsing in time with some invisible rhythm. I could almost feel a presence moving along the track, a force without shape but with awareness, aware of my intrusion, aware that I was listening. The fog thickened, and suddenly the whistle seemed closer, sharper, almost beside me, though I could see nothing. My head spun slightly, trying to reconcile what I heard with what I saw, or rather did not see. The night air pressed against my face, cold and damp, and I realized I was gripping the strap of my bag, knuckles white, eyes wide. The line stretched ahead, unbroken, disappearing into darkness that seemed alive. Then, without warning, the sound shifted. It no longer seemed distant but circling, moving around me in slow, deliberate arcs. I spun on the gravel, heart racing, trying to pinpoint it. The fog refracted the sound strangely. One moment it appeared ahead, the next behind, then to the side. I began to feel dizzy, unmoored from the track, as if I had stepped into a place where direction and distance no longer mattered. I took another step and the whistle fell silent. The world collapsed into near total quiet, broken only by the soft, uneven rustling of the trees and the faint drip of condensation from the leaves. I shivered. For a moment I considered leaving, turning back toward my car and the safety of the road. But a part of me resisted, the part that had driven hours to reach this line, that had sought the abandoned and the forgotten. I had to understand. I had to follow the sound wherever it came from. With slow, careful steps, I continued along the track. My boots sank slightly into the wet gravel, and the rails glimmered faintly under the dim light. I passed remnants of the past. A broken signal lantern, its glass cracked, a fragment of a wooden bench covered in moss, a rusted spike jutting from the ground. Each object seemed to pulse with memory, carrying whispers of the people and machines that had once passed through here. The whistle returned intermittently, softer now, almost shy, like a hesitant voice inviting me further. I noticed then subtle signs along the track, footprints pressed into the mud only faintly, as if someone or something had passed before me. They were irregular, not human, yet not entirely animal, and they followed the line with unnatural precision. I knelt to examine them, tracing a finger along the edges. They were cold, almost damp, and they seemed to vanish beneath my touch, leaving no trace. I felt a shiver, not from the cold, but from the realization that I was not the first to walk this path tonight, and perhaps not the first in years. The whistle shifted again, fatting in one direction and echoing from another. I followed instinct, moving toward the sound as it pulsed faintly through the fog. The mist seemed to respond, curling around my legs, obscuring the line ahead and behind, making the track feel endless. I realized that I had lost track of distance, of time. Minutes or hours might have passed. The night was no longer empty. It was thick with presence, subtle and patient, a living memory of trains, travelers, and forgotten stories. And then through the fog I saw it. A faint glimmer, a pinprick of light flickering in the distance. Not a lantern, not a signal, but something else. Something that hovered, moving slightly, pulsing with the same rhythm as the whistles. I froze, heart hammering, as the light moved along the track, just beyond reach, never stationary, always beckoning. My mind raced. Was it a reflection, a trick of the mist, or something alive waiting, aware of me? I took a tentative step forward, then another, letting the rails guide me. The whistle sounded again, a low, melodic cry that filled the night air, and I felt the weight of the track itself pressing in, not violently, but with insistence. It wanted attention, wanted recognition. I was intruding on something that had been here long before me, something that remembered every footstep, every sound, every presence. As I followed the pinprick of light, the mist thickened further, hugging the rails, curling around my legs and waist. The whistle pulsed again, fatting and returning as if to test my resolve. I felt a strange dizziness, a sense that the world was stretching, bending, and that the abandoned railway line was not merely a place, but a corridor of memory, of echoes that had never fully faded. I paused, letting the fog and the sound wash over me. My ears strained for the faintest detail, my eyes searching for a shape, a movement, anything that could explain the impossible rhythm of the whistle. And I understood then that it was not a train, not a person, not even a living creature. It was the line itself, the memory of everything that had passed along it, made audible in the stillness, a phantom presence that called to anyone who dared walk its rails. I stayed there, listening, feeling the pulse of the whistle, the cold iron beneath my fingers, the mist curling around me. I knew I would not understand fully, not yet, but I also knew I would return, drawn again by the faint, impossible call of the abandoned line, by the whispers and the patient, mournful cries that echoed through the night. And somewhere deep inside, I feared that when I did, the track would remember me and I would become part of its story. I kept walking along the abandoned railway line, each step muffled by the gravel beneath my boots. The fog had thickened even further now, curling around my legs, twisting and swirling like fingers reaching up from the ground. The whistle from before had faded, leaving only the soft hum of the tracks and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. For a moment I thought I was alone, but I knew better. The line had a memory, and I was beginning to feel it pressing around me, quiet but insistent. It was then that I noticed the first traces of human presence, or what remained of it. A small suitcase lay half buried in the mud, the leather cracked and stiff with age. I crouched beside it, brushing away the wet leaves. The handle had rusted hinges and the corners were frayed, softened by years of neglect. I opened it slowly, expecting only dust and decay, but inside were remnants of a life paused. A folded scarf, a brass locket, and a small notebook, its cover faded. My fingers trembled as I picked up the locket, the metal cold and unyielding. The notebook contained faint, spidery handwriting. The pages were yellowed, the ink blurred from moisture, but some words were still legible. Names, dates, and brief notes, a journal kept by someone who had traveled this line perhaps decades ago. I ran my fingers over the words, feeling the weight of time pressing down, and a chill ran through me. There was a pattern, a string of entries detailing routine journeys, small observations, until one day the entries ended abruptly. The last note simply read, "The fog came and they did not return." A shiver crept up my spine. I glanced along the track, the fog masking everything beyond a few feet. I could almost imagine the travelers themselves, shadows frozen in the mist, moving silently and never quite stepping into the present. The suitcase seemed to hum softly under my hand, as though recognizing the living as someone who dared to witness what had been forgotten. I closed it carefully, but I could not shake the feeling that the items had eyes, watching me even as I moved forward. Not far from the suitcase, I spotted more remnants: a worn hat, a pair of children's shoes, the broken frame of a photograph. The image inside was cracked, the edges curling with age, but I could make out a family standing by a train platform. Smiles frozen, eyes bright, unaware that decades later their presence would dissolve into fog and rumor. I picked up the frame carefully. The glass rattled faintly in my hand, as though something inside wanted to escape, to be acknowledged. The whistle returned then, faintly, but this time different. Softer, more deliberate, almost like a sigh carried across the rails. I paused, listening. My breath came in shallow puffs, misting in the cold night air. Somewhere ahead, the fog parted just slightly, revealing the curve of the track disappearing into blackness. I had no clear destination, yet an urge compelled me forward, toward the unseen, toward the echoes of those who had vanished long before my arrival. As I walked, I noticed the ground itself began to change. The gravel became muddier, soft, and yielding, as though the earth had absorbed countless footsteps over the years. Faint impressions appeared in the mud, scattered and irregular, like footprints left by people or something that had once been human. Some were small, childlike. Others were larger, adult-sized. None were recent, yet they seemed impossibly fresh. I slowed my pace, hesitant, feeling the weight of every step, listening for any sound that might accompany me. I stumbled upon another collection of items: a torn suitcase, scattered letters yellowed with age, and a single photograph of a man staring directly at the camera, his expression unreadable. The photograph seemed unnervingly recent, despite the wear around the edges. I held it up, feeling a strange connection to the figure in the image. The man's eyes appeared almost alive, as if they could see me, even through decades and fog. I felt the hairs on my arms stand on end. There was a story here, one that had been interrupted, left unresolved, and now, somehow, it was drawing me in. The fog shifted again, and I thought I glimpsed shapes moving in the distance. Shadows, perhaps, or the remnants of figures long gone. Each movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, vanishing when I tried to focus on it. I told myself it was my imagination, the mind playing tricks after hours of wandering these abandoned rails. Yet the unease persisted, an undercurrent running through my chest and settling in my stomach. Something was watching, patient and silent, waiting for me to notice. I knelt to examine one of the scattered letters. The ink had faded, but a few words remained. Train never came. Fog too thick, we waited, alone. The handwriting was small, hurried, trembling. I shivered. These were messages frozen in time, cries from a moment that no longer existed, yet somehow persisted in the memory of the place. I could feel their desperation, their anxiety, even their resignation, as if the track itself had absorbed it all and now whispered it to anyone willing to listen. The whistle sounded again, closer now, circling the fog in a pattern I could not follow. My pulse quickened, and I realized I had moved further along the line than I had intended. The trees on either side of the track leaned inward, as though conspiring to block the path behind me. The fog seemed almost solid, thickening around my legs and chest, a soft pressure that reminded me with every step that I was not alone. Another photograph lay in the mud, half buried. It showed a train station, long abandoned even at the time the picture was taken. A crowd of people waited on the platform, their faces blurred, their expressions uncertain. Something about the photograph unsettled me. The more I stared, the more it seemed to pulse faintly, as if the faces were moving slightly in the corner of my vision. I set it down gently, telling myself I was imagining things, yet the feeling did not fade. The track itself felt alive, aware and patient. I came upon a final group of belongings, an overturned cart, a child's toy, and a journal, its pages damp and curling. The entries were fragmented, describing trips to the line, family visits, farewells, and then, abruptly, panic. The whistle, one note read. It calls us. We can't leave the track, it keeps us. I swallowed hard. I had followed the same sound, and now the words seemed to resonate with my own experience, a reflection of the unease that had settled in my chest. The mist thickened, and the whistle rose once more, close enough that I could feel its vibrations in the air in my chest. I looked along the line and could just make out the faint glimmer of the rails stretching into darkness. I realized then that these lost passengers, the scattered belongings, the photographs, the half-written journals, were not just remnants. They were warnings, a record of the past repeating itself, a cautionary echo meant to be heard by anyone who dared to walk the line. I paused, letting the fog swirl around me. The whistle pulsed once, a final mournful note that seemed to linger, stretching across the tracks, across the years, across memory itself. I felt a weight pressing against me, the sense that the line had remembered me, and that I in turn would carry these echoes with me even after I left. The lost passengers had not been entirely erased. They existed here in whispers, in fog, in shadows that moved just beyond sight. And now I was part of that story too. I took a careful step forward, boots crunching on the gravel, heart heavy and mind buzzing with the faces, the notes, the items left behind. I could not see them clearly, could not touch them fully, but their presence pressed against my awareness, a quiet, insistent reminder that some histories never truly vanish. The track was patient, and it would wait for anyone else drawn to its call, just as it had waited for me. The whistle faded gradually, leaving only the soft rustle of the trees and the fog curling along the rails. I paused again, breathing deeply, letting the damp air fill my lungs. Somewhere ahead, the track continued, endless in the darkness. And though I could turn back, retrace my steps to the world of certainty and warmth, I knew I would return. The lost passengers, their stories and their echoes had claimed a part of me, and the line would not forget. I had been walking the abandoned track for hours now, the gravel underfoot echoing softly in the quiet night. The fog was thick, curling around the rails like smoke, clinging to my clothes and skin, damp and cold. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from fatigue, but from the weight of anticipation. I knew the track held secrets, traces of lives once lived, echoes of those lost, but I had not expected what came next. It began with a faint vibration underfoot, so subtle that at first I thought it was my pulse. Then came a sound, distant and deliberate, the clatter of wheels on rails. My breath caught. I froze, straining to see through the swirling fog. The sound grew steadily louder, yet no train approached from the distance I could see. The trees on either side of the track were still, their skeletal branches leaning inward, as if they, too, were listening. And then I saw it. A faint glow appeared ahead, blurred by mist, moving slowly along the rails. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, perhaps the reflection of my own flashlight caught in the fog. But the glow solidified, coalescing into the unmistakable shape of a train. Its outline was soft and indistinct, almost liquid in form, yet I knew what I saw. A train, spectral and silent, gliding along rails that had been abandoned for decades. I wanted to step back, to retreat to the world of certainty and solid ground. But something rooted me in place, curiosity mixed with dread. I watched as the train drew closer, its shape becoming more defined. I could see the carriages, long and narrow, windows like dark eyes staring out at the world that had long since forgotten them. There were no passengers I could discern, only shadows, shifting and formless, moving inside as though the train itself breathed. I felt a chill run down my spine. The whistle came next, low and mournful, not loud or piercing but resonant enough to vibrate through my chest. It was a sound that belonged to no living engineer, a voice of the track itself, calling out across time. I wanted to cover my ears, but the sound seemed to sink into me, filling me with the same unease that had settled along this line for decades. As the train rolled past, I noticed the shadows in the carriages. They flickered in the corner of my eye, dissolving when I tried to look directly at them. Each shadow moved with intent, some gesturing, some bending as if searching for someone or something lost. I realized then that the train was not empty. Its passengers were the echoes of lives interrupted, each trapped in their own suspended moment, unable to step off the line, unable to return to the world beyond the fog. I took a careful step forward, my boots crunching softly on the gravel. The shadows shifted again, more deliberately now, following the glow of the train. I felt an almost magnetic pull toward the last carriage, the one at the very end. I do not know why I approached, why I allowed myself to walk toward it when every instinct screamed to flee. Perhaps it was the same curiosity that had driven the lost passengers to this track decades ago, or perhaps it was something else, something I could not name. The last carriage shimmered in the fog, its edges wavering like mist caught in moonlight. I reached out a hand, and the air seemed to thicken around me, heavy and cold. For a brief moment, I thought I felt the texture of the metal beneath my fingers, smooth and impossibly solid, yet impossible to hold. The shadows inside stirred violently, then vanished in an instant, leaving only a darkness that pressed back at me. I stumbled slightly, my heart pounding. The whistle sounded again, closer now, echoing inside my skull, vibrating through my chest. The train rolled past, and for a fleeting second I thought I saw faces. Faces pressed against the glass, mouths open in silent cries. I blinked and they were gone. The carriage was empty, or perhaps they had always been beyond my perception, visible only to those who dared to look too closely. The fog shifted around me and I felt a presence behind me, soft but insistent. I turned, but the tracks were empty. Only the rustle of leaves and the distant echo of the spectral whistle remained. I told myself it was the wind, my imagination fueled by hours of wandering this line. But the feeling did not fade. Something had followed me, patient and unseen, lingering in the spaces where light could not reach. I moved along the track, my eyes fixed on the path ahead, but the last carriage lingered in my vision, impossibly close yet just out of reach. It was as if it existed both in the world I occupied and in a parallel reality, a memory of the track that had never fully faded. I realized then that the train was not a vehicle at all. It was a bridge, a threshold between what had been and what still haunted these rails. The items I had seen earlier, the suitcases, the photographs, the journals, suddenly made sense. They were not mere remnants. They were signposts, traces of those who had come before me, warnings etched into time. The last carriage carried their essence, the final repository of stories that had never been told and endings that had never arrived. I felt the weight of those lost lives pressing against me, an invisible hand brushing along my shoulder, urging me to remember, to acknowledge. I dared to step closer, and the air thickened again like walking through water. I could see movement inside the carriage, subtle and deliberate, shadows shifting against shadows. For a moment, I thought I glimpsed a child sitting alone, staring out at the fog, her eyes bright in the dim light. Then she was gone, leaving only the echo of a laugh, soft and fleeting, carried away by the mist. I shivered, feeling a connection to all of them. Lost passengers who had lingered too long, whose stories had been interrupted, whose presence still clung to this track. The whistle sounded one final time, long and low, and the train began to fade into the fog. The shadows inside dissolved into nothingness, leaving only the shimmer of the last carriage. Then even that dissolved, leaving the rails empty and silent. My heartbeat slowly returned to normal, though the sense of being watched persisted. I knew I had glimpsed something that could not be fully understood, something that existed beyond the boundaries of time and memory, a presence anchored to the line itself. I continued walking, boots crunching softly, the fog swirling around me. Each step carried the weight of what I had seen, the knowledge that some tracks are never truly abandoned, that some passengers never leave. The items scattered along the rails seemed to hum faintly, as if acknowledging my passage, as if marking me as part of the history of this place. The echoes of the last carriage, of shadows vanishing and faces pressed against invisible glass, lingered in my mind, refusing to fade. I paused and looked back along the track, half expecting to see the train reappear, to see the last carriage waiting for me in the fog. But the rails were empty, silent but for the soft rustle of leaves and the distant, fatting vibration in the ground. I felt the pull of the place, the patience of the track, the awareness that it held a memory, and I understood that the line itself remembered me as I would remember it. The fog shifted one final time, curling around my legs and dispersing my thoughts. I drew a deep breath, tasting the damp night air, and pressed onward. The lost passengers, the shadows, the last carriage, they were not gone. They existed in the spaces between reality and memory, in whispers carried along the rails, in the soft hum that lingered long after the train had vanished. And I knew, as I walked through the night, that I had become part of that continuum, a witness to stories that could never truly end, stories that would haunt this line forever. The whistle faded completely, leaving only the soft crunch of gravel under my boots, the fog settling back into its endless, curling dance. I moved forward, heart still heavy, mind alert to every shadow, every whisper, every echo of a presence that refused to leave. The last carriage was gone, yet its memory clung to me, a reminder that some tracks never truly end and some passengers never really disappear. I kept walking, deeper into the fog, carrying with me the stories of those who had vanished, those who had lingered, and those who had waited too long to leave. The track stretched onward, silent and patient, and I understood that my journey was only beginning. The road stretched before us like a ribbon of gray, curling through the hills in gentle, lazy curves. The fog was already thick when we left the town behind, curling around the trees and brushing against the windshield with a damp, persistent chill. I watched it from the passenger seat, the pale light from the headlights barely cutting through the white haze. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and pine, a scent that should have been comforting, but tonight it felt heavy, almost deliberate, pressing against me as though the fog itself were aware of us. My wife Fatima sat beside me, gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. She kept glancing at the GPS, muttering numbers and directions, though I could see her unease in the way she tightened her shoulders each time the road curved. Our daughter, little Amina, dozed in the backseat, her small hands clutching a threadbare stuffed rabbit. Even in sleep, she shifted uneasily, as though she sensed what I was only beginning to understand. I tried to shake off the tension, told myself it was just the fog, just the unfamiliar road winding into the hills. But there was something in the stillness, something that didn't belong. The houses we passed were few and far between, their outlines swallowed by the mist, windows dark and unwelcoming. I couldn't see anyone outside, no lights flickering, no movement at all. It was the kind of emptiness that presses into your chest, making your breath shallow and your heart insistently loud. As we drove, the road began to narrow, flanked by trees whose branches arched over the asphalt like watchful arms. The fog thickened, and the headlights cut only a few feet ahead, leaving the rest of the world shrouded in white uncertainty. Fatima slowed, her knuckles pale on the wheel. "We're close," she whispered, almost to herself. I didn't argue. I knew she could sense it too, that subtle unease I felt coiling tight around my stomach. The hill rose before us, not steep, but insistent, as if it had been waiting for us all along. The trees grew denser here, their trunks black against the pale gray fog. A wind whispered through the branches, low and sibilant, carrying a sound almost like voices, but distant, distorted, and too fleeting to catch properly. I told myself it was the wind, that the mind plays tricks when you're tense, when you're moving toward the unknown. Yet the feeling persisted. The hill was alive and it was watching. We turned onto a gravel driveway, and the outline of the house became visible through the mist. It was older than I had expected, its frame worn and sagging, shingles missing in patches, windows dark and hollow. There was a crooked fence around the yard, some of the posts leaning as if they had given up resisting time and weather. The fog curled around the house like smoke, softening its edges, giving it a spectral quality that made me hesitate. Fatima parked at the edge of the yard, the tires crunching on the gravel. The engine's hum seemed deafening in the sudden, unnatural quiet. Amina stirred in the backseat, murmuring something incoherent, then sat up and rubbed her eyes. She looked out the window at the house, frowning. "It looks lonely," she said softly, voice barely above a whisper. I swallowed. "It's old," I said, forcing a calm I didn't feel. "It's just been empty for a while, that's all." But even as I said it, I felt the lie coiling in my chest. There was more to this place, I could feel it. A presence, subtle and patient, waiting just beyond the fog. We stepped out, the cold immediately biting at our skin. The mist seemed thicker here, curling around our legs and drifting through the yard with an almost sentient ease. Fatima went ahead toward the front door, her movements careful, precise, as though she were aware of the need to tread lightly. I followed, carrying the small duffel bag with our things, glancing around at the yard. The trees swayed softly, though there was no wind strong enough to move them, and the fence creaked as if stirred by invisible fingers. The house smelled of damp wood and mildew, a faint metallic tang lingering just beneath. Each step on the creaking porch seemed to echo too long, a resonance that made the walls feel as if they were breathing. Fatima tried the door handle, and it turned with unexpected ease, opening onto darkness that swallowed the weak light from outside. I hesitated at the threshold, feeling the weight of that darkness pressing back at me. Inside, the air was colder still, heavy with the smell of disuse. The furniture was sparse, draped in sheets that had yellowed with age. Dust floated in beams of light that filtered through the grimy windows, particles suspended like tiny ghosts. Every surface seemed to hum with the memory of what had been, the echo of footsteps, laughter, arguments, and silences long since past. I set the bag down, and my eyes were drawn to the staircase at the far end of the hallway. It led upward into shadows that seemed almost liquid in the fog of the house's interior. Fatima moved past me, glancing back over her shoulder, a faint furrow in her brow. "We'll start unpacking," she said softly. But even as the words left her lips, I could see her hesitance, the same unease mirrored in my own reflection in the darkened window panes. The fog outside pressed against the windows, and I felt a sense of isolation that went beyond mere geography. The hill, the trees, the house itself, it all felt like it had been waiting for us. Aware of our arrival in ways that were subtle and deliberate, I shook my head, trying to chase the thought away. It was just a house, an old hill, a misty evening, but even as I reasoned, I felt the undercurrent of dread coiling tighter in my chest. I moved toward the living room, my steps careful on the wooden floor. Each sound seemed amplified, carried along the walls and reflected back at me. I noticed small details: a chair tilted at an odd angle, a picture frame crooked, a rug bunched unnaturally in one corner. Nothing overtly threatening, nothing alive, yet every detail contributed to a sense that the house was observing, adjusting, and waiting. Fatima unpacked a few boxes, moving silently, while I lingered near the window, peering into the fog. The hill was obscured, ghostly shapes of trees and brush shifting in the low light. The wind, or whatever it was, made a soft, keening sound through the branches, a sound that seemed almost like a voice calling out to me from beyond the mist. I pressed my hands to the glass, trying to see clearly, and for a fleeting moment I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the yard. Then it vanished, leaving only the rolling fog and the uneasy quiet. Amina wandered to the window, standing on tiptoe, her small hands pressed to the glass. "Daddy, there's someone there," she said, voice trembling slightly. I knelt beside her, brushing her hair back, trying to dismiss the sight. "It's just the fog, sweetheart, nothing else." Fog plays tricks on the eyes. But even as I spoke, I could not fully convince myself. The feeling had been there from the moment we left the town, lingering like a shadow at the edge of vision, patient and unyielding. We spent the evening inside, moving slowly, unpacking, arranging, trying to create a semblance of normalcy. Yet the fog never lifted. It pressed against the windows like an unspoken warning, curling into corners, seeping into the cracks of the old house. Every sound outside, a snap of a branch or rustle of leaves, set my nerves on edge. Each time I glanced toward the hill, I felt it watching, waiting, patient beyond understanding. By the time night fully settled, the house had taken on a life of its own in my mind. Shadows pooled in corners, stretching and bending with subtle motion. The floorboards whispered beneath our feet, and the wind, or whatever moved through the trees, carried a low, continuous murmur that I could not place. Sleep came fitfully for all of us, broken by imagined footsteps, fleeting shapes at the window, and the relentless weight of the fog that refused to lift. I lay awake long after Fatima had dozed, staring at the ceiling, listening. The house was quiet, but the quiet was too precise, too complete, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something or someone. I felt a presence in the room with us, subtle and patient, just beyond the reach of sight. I could not see it, could not name it, but I could feel its awareness, the slow, deliberate attentiveness that made my skin prickle. Outside, the fog shifted in the moonlight, curling around the hill, around the trees, around the house. It was not a simple mist, not a passive element of nature, but something alive, shaping itself, waiting. I felt the weight of it pressing inward, pressing against the very walls, and I understood with a clarity that was both horrifying and undeniable that we had not merely moved near a hill or an old house. We had moved into a place that remembered, a place that observed, a place that could not, and perhaps would not, let us go. And in that moment, lying awake in the dark with my daughter's soft breathing beside me, I realized that the unease I had felt from the start was not my imagination. It was a warning. It was an acknowledgement from the hill, from the house, from the fog itself, that we had arrived, and that arrival had been noticed. The morning came slowly, gray and diffused through the fog that still clung to the house. I woke before anyone else, lying in bed and listening to the quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of an empty house, but a thick, waiting quiet, the kind that makes you aware of every small creak, every whisper of wood settling. The fog pressed against the windows, soft and endless, hiding the hill beyond, making it feel as though the house floated in a world of pale nothingness. I rose carefully, trying not to disturb Fatima or Amina. The house felt heavier than yesterday, as though it had inhaled during the night and would not exhale. I moved through the hallway barefoot, listening. The floorboards gave under my weight in familiar groans, and I paused at the staircase leading to the upper floor. My heart thumped when I heard it, a soft, deliberate creak coming from above. Not a settling sound, something alive, packing. I froze. The room above should have been empty. No one had been up there yesterday. We hadn't unpacked anything beyond the main floor. And yet the sound persisted. Step, pause, step. Another pause, then a faint knock as if someone had tapped a finger against a wooden door. I told myself it was the house. Old houses groan. Old houses knock themselves loose in the settling of walls. But the rhythm, deliberate and measured, didn't match the way wood usually settles, and it came again. Step, pause, knock. I crept back to our bedroom, trying to keep my mind from racing. I could see Fatima stirring beside me, frowning, already sensing the unease that had taken root overnight. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. She shook her head slowly, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "It's probably nothing. The house, it's old." Her voice was calm, but I saw the tension in her jaw, the way her eyes lingered on the ceiling. Even she could feel it, the presence, subtle but undeniable. We went about the morning with careful routines, breakfast prepared in silence. Amina, as usual, asked questions about the fog and the hill, but her voice was hesitant now, as though she too felt the unspoken weight pressing around us. After breakfast, I went outside to inspect the yard. The fog clung to the grass, curling around the fence posts and the leaning trees. It obscured the hill, the slope disappearing into a pale haze. I could see nothing, yet I felt watched. Returning inside, I noticed a small detail that had escaped me yesterday. The door to the attic at the top of the stairs was slightly ajar. I had checked it when we arrived, or at least I thought I had. The latch had seemed secure then. Now, just a few hours later, it had opened on its own, a narrow gap revealing shadows inside. Fatima and I exchanged a glance. Neither of us spoke, but the weight of understanding hung between us. The house had moved while we were outside, or something had moved within it. I could not yet name it, could not yet call it by its presence, but I felt it, patient and deliberate. The creaking upstairs returned that evening, long after Amina had gone to bed. I was alone in the living room, pretending to read, but my attention was torn by the soft noises above. Footsteps packing in a pattern that should have belonged to no one. Creak, 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 and knock, creak. They circled the room, packing, deliberate and unnerving. I called Fatima quietly. "Upstairs again," I whispered, voice low, trying not to startle her. She came to the living room, concern etched in her features. Together we listened. The sounds persisted, patient, deliberate. We dared not investigate, not yet. Each step and knock pulled at something inside me, a memory buried, a dread I could not name. As the night deepened, the footsteps changed. They moved slower, then faster, as if hesitating, considering, deciding. The knocks came softer now, almost gentle but deliberate. Our home, supposedly safe, had become a cage of uncertainty. Every corner, every shadow seemed to respond to those upstairs movements, bending slightly, listening. Sleep came in fits. I would wake at intervals, heart racing, imagining shapes shifting in the hallways, the attic door opening wider, revealing something that wasn't there when I looked. Fatima did the same. Amina dreamt fitfully, murmuring things that sounded like names, whispered in the language of sleep, yet imbued with a fear we could not reach. By the second night, the pattern became undeniable. The footsteps came at irregular intervals, never entirely predictable. Sometimes they circled the upper hallway. Sometimes they paused directly above our bedroom, the knocks soft and lingering. I could feel the vibrations through the floorboards, a faint hum that settled into my chest, pulling tight my muscles, my nerves. I tried to rationalize it, searching for explanations. Mice, perhaps, or settling wood. An animal trapped in the attic. Yet none of these explanations satisfied the feeling pressing down on me. This was not random. This was deliberate, conscious, aware. On the third night, I stayed awake intentionally, lying on the couch in the living room. Listening. Fatima slept beside Amina, their breathing steady, untroubled by the sounds I could not ignore. The footsteps came, slower at first, circling above, then quickening as if responding to my alertness. And then I heard something different, a whisper, almost inaudible, threading through the air like smoke. Words I could not understand, yet distinctly human, carried in the rhythm of the steps. I moved cautiously toward the staircase. The air grew colder with each step, the temperature dropping as if the fog had found its way inside. I paused halfway, breath visible, heart pounding. The attic door was closed now, exactly as it had been before, smooth and ordinary. Yet the floorboards above creaked again, circling in the same pattern. I retreated, unsure of what to do. To call out, to investigate, seemed too dangerous, yet to ignore it was impossible. The house had claimed this floor, these sounds, this rhythm, and I realized with a creeping horror that it had begun to claim me as well. In the following days, our routines were consumed by the upstairs noises. Fatima tried to ignore them, insisting that focus on practical tasks might diminish their hold, but each night, the pattern returned. Step, step, pause, knock, step. The sounds adapted, seeming to anticipate our presence, to respond to our attempts at normalcy. I began keeping notes, recording the times, the sequence, the subtle variations. It became a compulsion, a way to hold on to reality, though I knew the record could not protect us. The fog outside seemed thicker each day, and even in daylight it pressed against the windows, blending the yard and hill into a single, indistinct mass. One evening, I caught something in the reflection of the window, a fleeting shadow in the hallway upstairs, moving just beyond the reach of the light. I blinked, and it was gone. No sound, no movement, nothing but the ordinary hum of the old house. And yet the feeling of being watched intensified. Amina began asking questions, small, tentative things. "Daddy, who walks upstairs when we sleep?" I could not answer. "I don't know, sweetheart," I said, and the lie sounded hollow even as I spoke it. Fatima glanced at me, concern etched across her features, understanding that I knew as little as she did. By the fifth night, I could no longer ignore the pattern. The footsteps had become part of our household, subtle and insistent. They marked the hours, dictating our sleep, our attention, our fear. Every creak, every knock, every soft whisper threaded through the walls, through the floors, threading into my mind. And yet, even as the dread grew, there was something hypnotic in the rhythm, a slow, deliberate insistence that demanded attention. I began to anticipate the pattern, to lie awake and listen, to measure the steps as they circled the upper hallway. I knew, in a way I could not fully explain, that the house was alive in its own patient way. It had a memory, a rhythm, and now it had acknowledged us. I lay awake, feeling the vibrations through the floor, hearing the steps above, counting them, memorizing the pauses, the knocks, the subtle shifts. And in that moment, I realized we had not moved into a simple hillside house. We had entered a place that remembered, a place that waited, a place that knew we were here. I had avoided the attic since the first night. Even the thought of climbing those narrow stairs sent a chill up my spine. The door, small and unassuming, seemed heavier than it should, as if the house itself resisted our intrusion. But after days of footsteps packing above us, of knocks and whispers threading through the walls, I knew I could not remain ignorant. There was something up there, something waiting, patient and deliberate, and I needed to see it. The afternoon light was gray, the fog outside still clinging stubbornly to the hill. Fatima and Amina were in the living room, quietly reading and playing, and I told myself I had only a few minutes before curiosity overcame caution entirely. I grabbed a flashlight and approached the attic door. My hand shook slightly as I reached for the latch, and I paused, listening. For a moment there was silence. Then the softest creak, a step, slow and deliberate, echoing somewhere beyond the ceiling. I inhaled deeply and turned the knob. The door opened with a reluctant groan, revealing darkness. The beam of my flashlight fell across a small, narrow room, the walls lined with boxes, old furniture, and stacks of papers yellowed with age. Dust motes floated in the beam, drifting lazily, suspended as if time itself had stopped in this corner of the house. I stepped inside. The air was thick, heavy, scented with mildew, and something else I could not name. A faint metallic tang, like rust and blood mingled, faint and distant. My foot disturbed the dust on the floor, leaving a small print that vanished almost immediately into the haze. The attic was cramped, slanted at the roofline, and filled with the kind of forgotten objects that accumulate in old houses. Trunks, broken chairs, stacks of books. But there were other things, too, things that made my stomach tight. Candles, partially melted and long unused, lay scattered on the floorboards. Some were upright in jars of ash, others toppled over, wax hardened into grotesque shapes. Charred remnants of paper clung to the walls, blackened at the edges, fragments of words I could not read. Then I saw it, a small box carved from dark wood tucked behind a pile of old linens. It was unremarkable, almost hidden, but the weight of attention around it made my hand ache before I touched it. I lifted the lid slowly. Inside were small, strange objects. Bones, polished smooth, arranged carefully. Dried flowers tied with thread. Tiny scraps of fabric marked with stains that made my stomach twist. The sense of ritual was undeniable. Someone had been here long ago, and had left these things as markers, offerings, or warnings. I sank to my knees, staring at the box, trying to force reason into my thoughts. Perhaps a child had played here, imagining ceremonies. Perhaps a family had kept keepsakes in secret, memorializing the dead in their own private ways. And yet, a deeper, colder understanding crept over me. This was deliberate, purposeful, and tied to the house itself. The attic seemed to shift around me. Shadows clung to the corners, forming shapes that vanished when I turned my head. The air thickened, pressing against my skin. I could hear faint whispers, just beyond comprehension, weaving through the dust, carried on currents I could not see. Step by step, the attic seemed alive, breathing around me. I turned my flashlight toward the far corner. There, draped over a chair, was a long, dark cloth, frayed at the edges. Beneath it, I could make out shapes, jars, more bones, scraps of paper. My pulse quickened. I realized the attic was not merely a storage room. It was a record, a memory, a place where the house had kept fragments of those who had come before. I moved closer, each step careful, deliberate. The floorboards groaned under my weight, echoing in the stillness. My hand brushed aside the cloth. The objects beneath were arranged with precision. A small doll, missing one eye, sat upright. A collection of keys, rusted and cold, lay beside it. A candle stub had melted onto a piece of parchment, the letters indistinct but suggestive of names, dates, events. I felt an inexplicable weight in the room, as if the air itself pressed against my chest. The whispers grew louder, threading through the silence, forming patterns I could not decipher. My mind raced, trying to find explanations. Perhaps the previous owners had been collectors of oddities. Perhaps this was nothing more than the remnants of eccentric lives. Yet the careful arrangement, the deliberate placement, spoke to something older, something tied to the house's memory, its will. A sudden movement made me freeze. A shadow shifted at the edge of my vision, tall and thin, stretching along the wall. When I turned, nothing was there. Only the objects, only the dust motes drifting in the flashlight's beam. My breath caught. I could feel the attic watching, patient, waiting for me to acknowledge its presence. I sank to the floor, unable to look away from the arrangements. Each item seemed to carry weight, a story I could not read but could feel. The bones, the dolls, the scraps of paper, they were echoes of lives that had passed through the house, lives that had left traces in the corners, in the shadows. And now they pressed against me, filling the air with a quiet insistence, a memory that demanded recognition. The hours passed, or perhaps only minutes, and I remained kneeling there, tracing the lines of the parchment with my fingertips. The attic seemed to settle around me, breathing softly, rhythmically. I realized then that the house had a history beyond its walls, beyond its visible structure. It held the traces of those who had come before, absorbing their actions, their fears, their rituals. I found a small journal tucked beneath a chair. The leather was cracked, the pages brittle. I opened it carefully. The entries were fragmented, written in a hurried, uneven hand. Names, dates, and strange observations filled the pages. Mentions of disappearances, odd behaviors, strange gatherings. The handwriting trembled at times as if the writer had been scared, feverish, aware of some presence beyond comprehension. The attic seemed to pulse as I read, the air thickening, shadows deepening. I could feel the weight of countless eyes, of countless moments pressing against me. Every sound, the groan of the floorboards, the faint sigh of the wind through the eaves, became amplified, threaded with memory, with past fear. A sudden gust rattled the small window at the peak of the roof. Papers scattered across the floor. I bent to retrieve them, hands trembling. Among them I found sketches, crude at first glance, of figures in dark robes, outlines of ceremonies, depictions of strange objects similar to those I had already seen. The sense of ritual, of deliberate action, pressed in on me, undeniable and unsettling. I rose slowly, aware of my own heartbeat echoing in the small room. The attic seemed to shift, the shadows moving subtly with me, anticipating my actions. The whispers had stopped, or perhaps I had stopped hearing them, too caught up in the weight of understanding, the creeping certainty that this place remembered, that it had always remembered. I backed toward the door, casting one last glance over the collection. Each object, each artifact seemed to watch me leave, patient, deliberate, unyielding. I closed the door behind me slowly, leaving the attic in darkness once more. The house exhaled around me, and for a moment the silence was overwhelming, a quiet that pressed against my ears and chest alike. As I descended the stairs, my mind churned. The attic had been a repository, a memory of rituals, of fear, of tragedy. And I realized with a growing sense of dread that the house had not shown me everything. It had revealed a fraction, enough to understand that we were not alone, that we were now part of its history, part of its memory. That night the footsteps upstairs resumed, but I was no longer entirely afraid. There was a rhythm now, a pattern I understood. The house moved, remembered, responded. And somewhere in that pattern, somewhere in the weight of the attic's objects and the whispers, lay the memory of what had come before, and perhaps a warning of what might come next. I lay awake beside Fatima and Amina, the memory of the attic pressing against my thoughts. Shadows in the corners of the room seemed to linger longer, the house itself humming softly around us. And I understood, finally, that the house was not merely a structure. It was a living memory, patient, deliberate, and it had already begun to mark us as part of its story. I didn't plan to go through the study that evening. The air was thick with the scent of rain seeping through the eaves, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and forces you to listen too closely. But the corner of the room had drawn my attention. A desk, worn and heavy, with a drawer that seemed slightly ajar. Something about it called to me, though I didn't understand why. I approached slowly, each step careful, as if the floorboards themselves could betray my presence. The drawer yielded with a reluctant groan, revealing a pile of yellowed envelopes, tied together with a brittle ribbon. I lifted the bundle, feeling the weight of time, of memory in my hands. The first letter was fragile, the paper soft and crumbling at the edges. The handwriting was meticulous, looping, elegant. Yet there was an edge to it, a tremor that suggested fear or urgency. I opened it slowly, reading the first lines aloud to myself softly, as if speaking too loudly might awaken something hidden in the shadows. It begins again. The blood cannot be forgotten. The house remembers and the watchers have returned. I froze. The words, though simple, carried a resonance that sent a shiver down my spine. My mind raced. Who had written this? And what had they meant? The letter smelled faintly of damp and ash, as though it had been hidden for decades, preserved in secrecy. I continued through the stack, uncovering letters spanning years, even decades. Each contained similar warnings, observations, and cryptic confessions. A pattern emerged. Mentions of people disappearing, shadows in the corners of rooms, footsteps with no source, whispers carried on the wind. There were references to the hill, the house, the rooms where the walls themselves seemed to watch. Among the letters were newspaper clippings, brittle and yellowed, their headlines screaming tragedies now almost forgotten. Local family found missing, house empty but intact. Stranger found dead by lakeside. No evidence of foul play. Unexplained disappearances baffle authorities. The articles were factual, restrained, yet the tone hinted at the fear that had gripped the town. I could sense it, the weight of terror, preserved in ink and print. One letter, particularly old, was written in a hand that wavered, almost illegible at times. It spoke of a series of murders that had begun decades before, each linked to the house on the hill. It follows the living. It waits in the rooms, beneath the floors, in the reflections. We thought it could be contained, but the watchers are patient, and the house remembers each name, each action. Those who come here carry the memory with them, whether they know it or not. I swallowed hard. The weight of the letter pressed against my chest. I thought of Fatima, of Amina, of the soft laughter and voices filling our home just hours earlier. How much had this place absorbed? How many stories lay folded, hidden in dusty corners, waiting for someone to read and awaken them? The attic, the footsteps, the strange shadows, they were no longer coincidences. They were echoes of something deeper, older. A presence that fed on memory, on observation, on fear. I felt it around me, a quiet hum in the walls, brushing against my skin, brushing against my thoughts. I spread the letters and clippings across the desk, trying to piece together a timeline. Names, dates, and events aligned into something chillingly coherent. Each disappearance followed a similar pattern. The family moved in, unease grew. Sounds at night began, someone vanished, and a new letter would appear, warning of what had been forgotten. I realized then that the house itself was an archive. It remembered every tragedy, every secret, every life that had brushed against it. And it was patient, deliberate. It did not need to act quickly. It only needed to wait for someone to notice, someone to read, someone to awaken the memory. I came across a letter addressed to no one, dated decades earlier, its words more direct, more frantic. Do not stay here. The hill keeps its own, and it will not release what it has claimed. The house watches. It has been patient, but it will not forgive intrusion. Leave before it notices you. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. I could hear the house around me, almost breathing, almost whispering. The wind rattled the windows, and somewhere a floorboard groaned softly, as if confirming the warning. I was aware in that moment of how fragile our lives were in comparison to the memory the house carried. Another clipping detailed the discovery of a missing child decades before. The description was hauntingly similar to Amina, dark hair, quiet demeanor, always watching. I felt my pulse quicken, a visceral fear I could not shake. Had the house remembered her already? Had it cataloged us the moment we arrived, unseen, unnoticed, but present? I paused, letting the realization settle. The letters were more than warnings, they were evidence. They were fragments of a history no one fully acknowledged, a chain of events linking generations, binding them to this place. I thought of the shadows I had glimpsed, the faint whispers I had heard, the objects in the attic arranged as if in ceremony. Every detail, every anomaly was part of a pattern, and the pattern was not benign. I moved the papers carefully, fearing to disturb some invisible balance. The light through the window was fading, and shadows lengthened across the desk. In them I thought I saw movement, quick, fleeting, vanishing when I focused. My throat went dry. The house was alive in ways I had not imagined. Not breathing, not sentient in a conventional sense, but alive in memory, in absorption, in the weight of every past action it had witnessed. A final letter, tucked beneath a stack of clippings, bore no date, no signature. Its words were simple, almost casual, yet they carried an edge of inevitability. You are part of it now. There is no leaving, not truly. The house keeps all who enter within its memory. You will hear them, you will see them, and you will know the past is never past. I sat back, the paper trembling in my hands. The wind outside had grown colder, sharper, slicing through the room. I could feel the air thickening, heavier, charged with expectation. I understood then that we were not merely visitors. We were participants in the history of the house. And the house was patient, meticulous, relentless. I gathered the letters carefully, stacking them in the drawer from which I had taken them. The desk groaned under my hands, as if acknowledging my actions. The room fell silent, but the silence was not comforting. It was expectant, waiting for me to step beyond it, to acknowledge what I now knew. I left the study slowly, every step deliberate, feeling the weight of unseen eyes following. Fatima and Amina were still in the living room, the normalcy of their presence almost unbearable in contrast to the revelations I carried. I forced a smile, careful not to betray the fear settling deep in my chest. That night as I lay in bed, I replayed every word I had read. The letters, the clippings, the warnings, they threaded a tapestry I could not ignore. The house was not empty nor benign. It had absorbed decades of human experience, of tragedy and fear, and it remembered everything. I realized that we were now part of that memory, woven into the history of the house. Each creak of the floor, each shadow in the corner, each whisper carried the weight of those who had come before. And somewhere, in the folds of time and memory, the house waited patiently for the next chapter to be written. Sleep was uneasy. I felt the presence of history pressing against the walls, pressing against me. The letters from the past were more than records. They were invitations, or perhaps warnings, signaling that the line between memory and reality was thin, fragile, and permeable. I knew with a certainty that settled cold in my bones that we had not simply moved into a house. We had entered a living history, one that would not release us easily, one that would watch, remember, and wait. And in the quiet moments before I drifted into uneasy sleep, I could almost hear the house sigh, patient, deliberate, and aware. The nights had grown heavier, like the air itself was pulling at my chest. Each evening I felt the house shift subtly, as if it were aware of our movements. It wasn't a presence I could see, not in a conventional sense. There were no figures, no shapes distinct enough to name. Instead, it was a series of impressions, tiny but persistent, pressing against my senses until I could no longer ignore them. It began with small things. The curtains, which I could have sworn I closed in the morning, were drawn open when I passed the living room in the evening. Footsteps echoed in the hall outside our bedroom, though Fatima and Amina were both asleep. The air seemed heavier near the stairs, as if carrying a silent weight. I began noticing it in my own reflection, too. The mirror in the hallway that should have shown me alone sometimes seemed to tremble at the edges, like something just beyond my vision moved and distorted the glass. Fatima noticed it before I did. She spoke of the feeling of being watched while cooking, of objects shifting slightly when she turned her back, of a cold draft brushing her neck even with the windows closed. I told myself it was imagination. I told myself the house was old, that creaks, drafts, and reflections were natural. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I had read too many letters, too many warnings. The memory of those words settled over me at night like a cloak too heavy to shake off. One night I woke to the sound of Amina crying. She was standing at the top of the stairs, her small hands gripping the railing. "Someone's there," she whispered, voice trembling, eyes wide and fixed on the empty hallway. I went to her side immediately, wrapping her in my arms, trying to mask the unease settling in my own chest. The hall was empty. The shadows were still, but the feeling lingered, stubborn and unrelenting. That evening, we moved together through the house with caution, our footsteps quiet, our voices hushed. The living room felt different, warmer, yet colder at the same time, like a draft of air carrying memories, like the house was exhaling centuries of observation all at once. I could hear the soft thrum of the floorboards under my feet, and each creak resonated differently than it had before, as if the house responded to us, tested us. I began to notice patterns. Doors closed themselves slowly behind us, or opened after a pause when we entered a room. Small objects appeared where they had not been, placed just out of reach, seemingly moved deliberately. Once, a book I had left on the kitchen counter was lying on the stairs in the morning, pages open to a passage I did not remember reading. Fatima tried to laugh it off, but I could see her unease, the way her hand trembled when she touched the edge of the table. I started keeping notes, recording the anomalies in a journal. Each entry added weight to my understanding. The house was not inert. It was aware. It remembered our actions, our presence. It responded. And while nothing had directly harmed us, the tension was a tangible thing, pressing down on our shoulders, lingering in our peripheral vision, infecting our thoughts. Amina, in her innocence, named it before we could. One afternoon, she said softly, "It watches, doesn't it, Papa?" I paused, pen in hand, staring at her. Her small face was serious, more serious than a 7-year-old had any right to be. "Yes," I said carefully, not wanting to frighten her, yet unable to deny it. "It watches." The letters from the study had warned of this, the way the house would absorb, observe, and react. I remembered the phrasing clearly. It keeps all who enter within its memory. The house did not act aggressively, not yet. It was patient, calculating. It seemed to measure us, to test the boundaries, to see how much it could impose before we recognized its influence. At night, I began hearing it in subtler ways. The floorboards hummed with low vibrations. The walls creaked in patterns I could not identify. I would lie awake, listening, certain that movement passed just beyond the edge of my awareness. Shadows shifted in corners when I looked away. Reflections in windows and mirrors were ever so slightly off. I could sense them, but never quite see them. Fatima began noticing similar things. She described whispers in the kitchen when she was alone, the feeling of cold breath near her neck, the sensation of being followed when she went upstairs. I wanted to reassure her, but I couldn't. I had seen it, I had felt it. We were not alone. One evening, while preparing dinner, I found the teapot from the kitchen on the hallway table. I had set it down on the counter just moments before. There was no one there. I called Fatima and she came, eyes wide. She did not speak. Neither of us moved it back. We left it, and when we returned an hour later, it was back in the kitchen. Small, deliberate gestures. The house was testing us, reminding us we were observed. Even the furniture seemed to react. Chairs would tilt slightly after we sat. Tables would shift imperceptibly when we left the room. Once, a photo frame that had leaned against the wall fell over on its own, revealing a picture of a family I did not recognize. They stared at us with the same wide eyes as Amina's, their expressions frozen in the moment of terror, caught somewhere between the past and the present. I began avoiding the mirrors, not out of superstition, but because I feared what I might see reflected. Distortions, movements, a presence lingering behind my own image. Shadows in the house did not behave naturally. They bent, lingered, followed, then vanished when confronted. Sometimes, when Fatima and I were in separate rooms, we would glimpse a shadow moving in unison, as though it existed in multiple places at once. We tried to keep normal routines, to maintain a semblance of life beyond observation. Meals, reading, bedtime rituals, they were all attempts at normalcy. Yet every small action seemed noted. The house responded subtly, never overtly but unmistakably. It was aware of us, alive in its own quiet, patient way. The attic became particularly charged with energy. I could feel the presence there before entering, a static in the air, the subtle vibration of attention. Amina refused to go up there alone, and I did not blame her. When I followed her once, a light breeze stirred despite the closed windows. Objects on the shelves seemed to shift subtly, as if aligning themselves in deliberate order. I touched nothing, yet felt as though each item regarded me, registering my intrusion. Sleep became restless. I would awaken in the dark of night, certain I heard footsteps packing outside our bedroom, or soft whispers threading through the walls. Fatima would wake too, whispering questions I could not answer. The house's presence was pervasive, like a slow current beneath everything we did. It was not threatening in a conventional sense, but it was inescapable. Sometimes I imagined its memory stretching back decades, collecting every family, every visitor, every curiosity and fear that had brushed against it. I could sense the cumulative weight pressing down, the resonance of long-forgotten tragedies, of lives folded into the architecture of the home. The letters, the clippings, they were fragments, warnings, keys to understanding the quiet vigilance that now enveloped us. We began to notice small temporal distortions. Minutes felt elongated in some rooms, shortened in others. We lost track of time in the living room, while the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly. I tried to rationalize, tried to attribute it to fatigue, to imagination, to the mind's response to stress. But I could not deny the patterns. The house manipulated perception subtly, a gentle insistence that it observed and influenced our reality. At times I questioned my own mind. Was I imagining the responses? The subtle shifts, the moved objects, the shadows that didn't match their source. The letters and clippings suggested otherwise. Each note, each record described similar occurrences spanning decades. The house's memory was long, its patience infinite, and it was aware of us. Fatima spoke less of what she felt, watching me, perhaps recognizing that words might give the presence strength, might invite it closer. We communicated in glances, in small gestures, silently acknowledging the reality we faced. Amina, too, adapted in her own way, her small footsteps cautious, her gaze flicking constantly to corners, to shadows. The air itself seemed charged at night, thick with anticipation, dense with the weight of the unseen. I could feel it in my chest, in my hands, in the slow rhythm of my breath. We moved through the house carefully, always aware, always watched. The knowledge of observation shaped our actions, forced us into a constant awareness of our own vulnerability. And yet, despite all of this, nothing directly harmed us. The house tested, observed, responded, but it did not strike. Its patience was deliberate, a slow assertion of presence that permeated every wall, every shadow, every creak and groan. I realized that the true terror was not in a sudden attack or visible monster. The terror was in the pervasive, patient watchfulness, the sense that nothing we did went unnoticed, nothing escaped its memory. By the end of the week, I found myself avoiding certain rooms entirely, walking past the attic, ignoring the study, sidestepping the living room during moments of peak tension. I felt the weight of the house pressing down, a reminder that it was alive, not in the way we understood life, but in the way it carried memory, history, and observation as an omnipresent force. The letters from the past had been warnings. The shadows, the whispers, the subtle movements, they were the house's reply. Patient, deliberate, constant. There was no need for violence. The presence itself, in its quiet awareness, was enough to unnerve, to reshape perception, to instill dread. And so, as night settled again, the wind whispering against the windows, the house groaning softly in acknowledgement of our presence, I understood something profound. We had not simply moved into a house. We had become participants in a living memory, cataloged silently by walls and shadows. And the presence, unseen yet undeniable, waited patiently, watching, remembering, and ensuring that every step we took, every word we spoke, every heartbeat was noted and absorbed into its infinite awareness. The house would endure, and we, willingly or not, were part of its consciousness now. And as I lay awake that night, listening to the subtle thrum of its quiet observation, I could not shake the sense that it was only beginning to show us what it remembered and what it intended for us.